After continued attacks on Red Sea shipping, the West makes good on its warnings, switching from words to action. Well, this hour, we'll talk to the Armed Forces Minister about the UK's involvement, as Labour says we back the action. It's Friday, the 12th of January. Well, after the overnight strikes in several Yemeni cities, Houthi militants vow to continue their attacks on global trade routes in the Gulf. Warships, fighter jets and Tomahawk missiles will analyse how the military action unfolded, as the MOD insists it was careful to minimise the risk to civilians.
Iran and Hezbollah have condemned the attacks. Saudi Arabia has expressed concern, and Russia has called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, all threatening stability in an already volatile region.
Rishi Sunak is facing demands to recall Parliament after authorising what he says were necessary strikes taken in self-defence.
Also ahead this morning, the public inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal continues as several more conviction appeals are heard for Scottish postmasters. And we await the UK's latest GDP data for November this morning. Any negative growth would put the UK on course for a technical recession.
And in sport, Colin Graves' expected return as Yorkshire chairman shows cricket is not safe for minority ethnic players, says racism whistleblower Asim Rafiq. And the new British and Irish Lions head coach, Andy Farrell, says the door is still open for his son Owen to play on next year's tour to Australia.
Welcome to Sky News Breakfast. Well, let's talk immediately about what happened overnight. Our defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is here with me, and you're going to be filling us in a moment, aren't you, about this big evening of action?
Yes, so RAF Typhoon jets operating out of Cyprus, armed with precision-guided bombs, joined with American warplanes and American ships and submarines in this significant attack. OK, more from you on that in just a moment, Deborah. So let's see how that action then unfolded overnight. And the US Air Force says it hit more than 60 targets across 16 sites in Yemen. There are reports of missiles hitting buildings in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, as well as Sada, Hodeidah, Taiz and Dhamma. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has our first report.
From an American warship in the Middle East, US jets on a mission which shifts the dial in a conflict they had sought to contain but could not. One after the other from the aircraft carrier, they flew to the night skies above Yemen. The mission to hit Houthi military targets, to disrupt and degrade drone and missile sites, to stop Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in one of the world's busiest sea lanes. And this is what the overnight horizon in Yemen looked like, filmed by locals at several locations. This represents a new chapter, a new regional challenge, a long way from Gaza and Hamas. The US military says missiles were launched from planes, from ships and from submarines, and they claim multiple targets were hit. It was a US-led military operation, but supported by the British. Here, from their base in Cyprus, 4 RAF Typhoon aircraft hit several targets, we're told. There was no appearance by President Biden to announce the action, but instead a statement. He said these targeted strikes are a clear message that the United States and our partners will not tolerate attacks on our personnel or allow hostile actors to imperil freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical commercial routes. I will not hesitate to direct further measures to protect our people and the free flow of international commerce as necessary. For weeks now, Western navies have tried to deter Houthi forces who have sought to turn these sea routes into the Wild West. Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones and missiles targeting international shipping, shot down repeatedly by the British and the US military, but this deterrence has not worked.
America and Britain for a while have been warning about this, and I think they could not allow it to pass. I think that's the other side of it. You know, people talk about red lines and people like that, but it is important. If you say this is unacceptable and we're going to do something about it, at some point you have to back those words up with actions.
On the face of it, the weeks of Houthi attacks were in solidarity with the Gazans, the Palestinian flag here alongside their own on a ship which they took. But really, this is all about Iran, regional influence, testing the West, capitalizing on destabilization. The question, what now? A Houthi official said in a statement that the strikes represent a brutal aggression against our country, for which they will pay absolutely and without hesitation, and we will not back down from our position in supporting the Palestinian people, whatever the cost.
The risk remains that Iran may respond, and it may respond in an asymmetric fashion. That is to say, there were just reports today that Hezbollah was looking at attacks on U.S. interests outside of the Middle East. And so this may not simply be more missiles, more seizing of tankers in the Persian Gulf. It may indeed be another kind of threat.
And so a region already so acutely on edge is now braced once more. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, let's bring in then our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. And Deborah, just how significant a moment is this for the UK to take action like this alongside the US and with the backing of other allies on these targets belonging to these Houthi rebels?
It's a hugely significant moment. It's a calculated escalation by the UK and the US. They have issued multiple warnings to the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels to stop these attacks against shipping in the Red Sea, attacks that were launched in the wake of Israel's war in Gaza, as Mark was saying, with the Houthi rebels claiming that they're doing this, targeting Israeli-linked ships, and they will continue to do that as long as the war in Gaza continues. But the US and the UK is very much shaping this attack that they launched overnight as protecting these vital shipping lanes, vital for world trade, vital to keep the flow of vessels going through the Suez Canal, and very much not wanting to link it to the other big war in the Middle East. Very much the big military presence that you have right now from the US, and less so, but still significant from the UK, is in the wake of the war in Gaza and is designed to prevent escalation. But what we're seeing right now is a very real risk of that happening.
And what do we know about the targets, and to what extent could it limit the Houthis' abilities to continue carrying out attacks?
Well, yeah, that's exactly the design of this. It was a careful balancing act. The allies needed to hit the Houthis to degrade their ability to launch these strikes, but not go in so hard that they threaten an uncontrolled, potentially, escalation, retaliatory action back. We've seen from the UK images being released. They had 4 Typhoon jets launched from an airbase in Cyprus, RAF Akrotiri, armed with precision-guided Paveway 4 bombs, and their mission was to target 2 specific facilities, one in northwestern Yemen, another an airfield. They said both had been used to launch missile strikes, drone strikes, reconnaissance drones. I've been told by a source that the understanding is that the operation was successful, but key now is going to be the retaliation. The Houthis have said they'll strike back. There are British warships, American warships, other warships in the Red Sea waiting in case that does happen. And then we'll see whether the US and the UK decide to strike again, because the US has warned that further action will be taken if these strikes continue by the Houthis.
OK, Deborah, thanks very much indeed. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from Alistair Bunkle, our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Rob Powell is also outside number 10 for us this morning. But first, let's get more from Mark Stone, who's in Washington, D.C. for us today. And Mark, the US, along with the UK, have been warning of retaliation for attacks on ships in the Red Sea for some time now. So was it seen that this action was inevitable there?
Yes. I mean, you don't set red lines unless you are prepared to follow through. And it is clear that the Houthi rebel group has been pushing and pushing and pushing. And so the point came where they had to follow through. The coalition, the Western coalition, had to follow through. And in the form of America and Britain, they have done just that. But don't assume that President Biden or Prime Minister Sunak wanted to do this. They did not, and that much is clear by the fact that it's taken them so long to do it. I mean, remember that these attacks against commercial ships in the Red Sea and elsewhere have been taking place for weeks now, and yet only now they have decided that they have to follow through and take action, and they have. And overnight, I've spoken to administration sources here who have said that they describe it as significant action. I think there was what's described as a menu of different options that the military commanders, both in London and in Washington, had given to their political masters, and from that menu, the suggestion is that quite a significant option was taken. Significant action, I'm told, conducted with every objective and every expectation that it will degrade the Houthi capability, quote, in a significant way. Well, we'll see. There is a real risk, of course, of collateral damage, given the way that the Houthis operate. There will be civilians in and around the areas that were hit. Were they hit as well? We will find out about that. So significant risk there. And then more broadly, as you were discussing with Deborah, there's a risk of mission creep, because once you set red lines, the Houthis, it's baked in, I think, that the Houthis will respond in some sort over the course of the next few hours. What happens then? And do other Iranian proxies then get involved? You can see a confluence of events here, a confluence of crises. It's a dangerous moment.
OK, Mark, thank you. Well, let's go to Rob Powell now, who's in Downing Street for us this morning. So, Rob, what's the Prime Minister said about this decision to launch attacks?
So my sense from the government this morning, Anna, is that they are pretty confident in how they have conducted this and how they have gone about essentially authorising these attacks. One source saying that military action like this is always a last resort, but a number of warnings had been issued. And as Mark was saying there, when you set a red line, you do then have to follow through with it if that red line is not stuck to. The announcement was made from the UK side at about 12:30 late last night, and Rishi Sunak described the action as proportionate, limited and necessary, and taken in self-defence because of the impact these Houthi attacks were having on global navigation and the knock-on impact that was having on things like commodity prices. The US has clearly suggested that if the attacks continue, they won't hesitate to act again. My sense this morning is that the UK would again potentially be involved in that and would agree to more strikes if they were seen as necessary to protect these shipping channels. In terms of the parliamentary picture here, there has been demands from some opposition parties and opposition MPs for Parliament to be recalled to discuss this and potentially vote on it. I think that's unlikely. I think it is probably more likely that when MPs return to Westminster on Monday, this will dominate business. There is, of course, the question as well of whether a vote is given when Theresa May authorised airstrikes in Syria. A retrospective vote was given after the strikes had taken place. There is no sort of codified necessity for that to happen. So I think that may well be unlikely. It may well be a formality, even if there was a vote anyway, because this morning Labour sources have said that the party backs this action to protect global shipping. We have heard from some critical voices, including people like the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, who has warned about the possibility for escalation. I think on the Conservative side, you are likely to see quite widespread backing for this, although already we have had one former minister, someone that until quite recently was a minister, Neil O'Brien, saying that he is in theory behind this, but that the UK needs to be straight and clear about what the objectives are and what success looks like.
OK, Rob, thanks for that. So let's go to Alistair Bunkle, who's in Jerusalem for us this morning. And Alistair, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has just returned from a trip to the region where he was warning about the risk of the spread of conflict in that area. Is that what's happening there now?
Well, I think the Americans and the British would sort of turn that on its head and say what they're trying to do is to prevent further spread, because what they're trying to do is stop the Houthis attacking Red Sea shipping and all the consequences that has. And as Mark was saying, it's somewhat baked into their calculus that the Houthis probably will continue their attacks on Red Sea shipping, and it might be that the US, the UK, and perhaps others have to take further action. But the hope will be is that this is a move born out of necessity, with patience having run out, in order to try and at least calm one area of sensibility within the region at the moment. But it all does come back to the Israel-Hamas war. That is why the Houthis have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea in support of Hamas. Now, in terms of what reaction we could see around the region, well, Hamas are sufficiently degraded now by Israel that we're not going to see any meaningful reaction from Hamas. Yes, they've condemned the attacks, but I can't see any kind of actual action from Hamas. Hezbollah, which is really Iran's most powerful proxy, up in Lebanon on the Israeli border, well, Hezbollah have very carefully calibrated their response to the Israel-Hamas war. There has been pretty much a daily exchange of fire along that border, and yeah, in the last week or so, things have got even more tense up there. But I'm not sure that this moment is the moment that Hezbollah will calculate that they want to escalate things further. If they haven't already done it over the last 3 and a bit months, given everything that's been going on in Gaza, why would they choose now as the moment to try and escalate things further? And so I suppose the question for me is how does Iran leverage its proxies, particularly around the region? You might see attacks on US bases in Iraq, for example, which have been happening quite regularly, and the US have been carrying out attacks against Iranian-backed militia in Iraq. We saw the assassination of a senior leader in Baghdad only a few days ago. So I think, I would look to places like Iraq, northeast Syria, where US troops are based. I would look as well to the Red Sea and see what the Houthis do there. And yeah, of course, when you've got a region as volatile as it is at the moment, anything like this does threaten to make it even worse. The US and the UK will hope that they've given the Houthis a punch on the nose sufficient that it stops them carrying out attacks. I'm not sure that it will do, though.
OK, Alistair Bunkle there in Jerusalem. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks too to Rob Powell in Downing Street and Mark Stone in Washington. And just to let you know that we will get the reaction from the government in a very short time. We're expecting to talk to James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, just in the next few minutes. But in the meantime, let's just bring you some breaking news on the UK economy. And we've just had the latest GDP or growth figures. So let's go straight to our economics editor, Ed Conway, now. So, Ed, tell us about these figures. What do they tell us?
So we every month we get an update on how the economy is doing. GDP is basically that kind of best measure of how much output we're creating. What does that mean? It means the amount of cash, the amount of activity that's going on in the economy. It's kind of the best measure of overall activity. There are some people who have question marks over GDP, but nonetheless, gives you a sense of how we're doing. And this is the metric we use to work out whether the UK is in recession. Well, we get it every month these days, and the latest month's numbers have just come in for November, and they show that the economy grew by 0.3% in November, which is actually quite good. It's better than expected. Economists have been thinking maybe, or the kind of consensus of economists was maybe 0.2% growth. But it's worth saying the previous month it actually fell by 0.3%. And so take a step back, and broadly speaking, the UK economy is flatlining. I mean, that's the big picture here. And this doesn't really change that. Does it mean that there is a chance of the UK falling into recession? Well, yes, statistically, because the previous quarter, the technical definition of recession is 2 quarters of successive contraction. So the economy shrinking, us getting less well off for 2 quarters in a row. The previous quarter, the economy did contract. There were some numbers that came in that were revised on that. This quarter, most economists think actually the economy should grow. But the big question is what happens for those December numbers. But most people think that actually ahead of Christmas, there was a bit more spending, there was a bit more activity. Interest rates were, in terms of the mortgage rates, were starting to come down for fixed rate mortgages. So they think that maybe things did improve a little bit then. But as I say, take a step back. And it's not like you're looking at this economy and saying it's racing ahead. It is basically flatlining and has been flatlining for quite some time. These numbers don't change that. But on the bright side, they are a little bit better than expected, which is good news. They could have been worse. And they do mean that the UK it has quite a good chance of avoiding recession, which is not nothing given that you have many economies around Europe which are facing recession and which have faced recession this year. The Chancellor said, while it's welcome news, it'll be slower as we bring in, so growth will be slower as we bring inflation back to its 2% target. So the Chancellor looking at these numbers as well. But as I say, the big question is what happens in the following month? Do we see those numbers dip down? Most economists think, fingers crossed, they shouldn't.
OK, we will be back to you whenever we get all those figures. But Ed, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Thanks. Now, the public inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal resumes this morning. And also today, the cases of several postmasters will be heard in Scotland, where appeals against convictions are also underway. So let's get you up to date. Saba Chowdhury is here with more. Hello to you, Saba. So it's been an extraordinary week in this story, hasn't it? So what is going to happen today?
Good morning, Anna. So just start with a little bit of context. It was called an appalling miscarriage of justice by the Prime Minister, and with very good reason. Across the country, about 700 people, more than 700 people, were wrongly accused of theft and false accounting for something that it turns out to be was a fault with an IT system called Horizon. Now, as a result of that, there was a very human cost, and we saw lots of people going to prison. There was bankruptcy, and in some cases, death by suicide. Now, people are still fighting to clear their names today. In Scotland, an appeals process is underway. To date, about 100, we've seen 100 wrongful convictions in Scotland, and only 4 of which have been overturned. And the Scottish First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has said that he is working closely with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to overturn these and to ensure that the victims are exonerated. Now, meanwhile, in London, an inquiry into the scandal is ongoing. Just yesterday, Stephen Bradshaw, who is an investigator, a fraud investigator at the Post Office, denied, there he is on screen speaking at the inquiry yesterday, he denied that he and other investigators like him behaved like mafia. That was the accusation. And he also said very clearly that he was not technically minded and not an expert when it comes to IT, and most particularly that system Horizon. However, at the time, had signed a document basically saying that the Post Office had absolute confidence in the system. So accountability really still needed. And for now, although there is a compensation scheme in place, for many of those victims, they're saying no matter how much money is thrown at this, no matter the laments or the apologies, the damage is done. And it's going to take far more than just a few words from those in power to fix the hurt that they and their families have been going through these past few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And some way for the inquiry to go as well, yes, before it reaches any conclusions too. Saba, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Well, let's go back now to our top story and continue with the breaking news that the UK and the US have conducted strikes against military facilities used by Houthi rebels in Yemen. Well, the crisis in the Red Sea and Gulf of Oman has come about because of attacks on 2 of the world's most important shipping routes. So yesterday's seizure of a tanker off the coast of Iran and the UAE is thought to be the first time that Iran has targeted a ship in the Gulf of Oman since Israel declared war on Iranian-backed Hamas militants in Gaza on October the 7th. The war in Gaza also led to an increased threat to ships transiting the Red Sea after Houthi fighters based in Yemen started targeting vessels in November. Well, the crucial Red Sea trading route takes ships through the Suez Canal and into the Mediterranean Sea, and it's the key route for ships travelling from the Middle East to Europe. And one of the world's primary trading routes used by 15% of global shipping. As for the Strait of Hormuz, it's the most important oil choke point and has previously been used by Iran as a way to heap pressure on the United States and its allies. Back in 2019, Iranian forces targeted multiple ships in this region, including the British-flagged oil tanker, the Stena Impero. Well, earlier, my colleague Vanessa Baffo spoke to Colonel Brendan Carney, who's the former Chief of Staff of the US Marines.
Politics really trump the national interest for a lot of the free democracies of the world, including the United States and the UK. And I'll speak specifically to the United States. Quite honestly, I don't think that President Biden really felt that it was worth the risk. And with the ensuing passage of time, particularly since October 7th, with the tragedy in Israel and the ensuing hostilities in the Gaza Strip, we've seen an increase in these attacks. And again, the Houthis are saying that they're doing it to help their, Hamas brothers, and they're targeting, specifically Israeli ships. And that's there's no truth to that at all. The Houthis are targeting anything that's floating. And, if they can go after a U.S. warship or a British warship, they'll try that too. So there was a lack of will. There was a lack of, quite frankly, there was a lack of guts on the part of our president. And somehow over the last couple weeks, he's found some, and notwithstanding the pressure he's gotten from his own members of his own party, and also the Republicans in Congress and the American people.
And Brendan, any idea on specific targets that would have been hit, and crucially moving forward, how the operation will be navigated in order to avoid civilian casualties and deaths?
Well, the targeting hopefully is meaningful targets. And what do I mean by that? It won't be some ammo dump sitting out in the middle of the desert that people will really not even know was hit or not. This has got to be something, or a series of targets that make a difference, that carry a clear, unambiguous message to the Houthis and also to Iran, that the United States and its coalition partners, the UK in particular, are not going to tolerate these attacks on shipping, particularly in one of the most absolutely critical sea lines of communication. As to your last point, obviously we want to minimize any civilian casualties. I mean, the tragedy ongoing in Gaza right now has that in the forefront of everyone's concern, as it should be. But there is absolutely no way that you conduct these types of high-intensity military operations without having the innocents suffer somehow.
That was Colonel Brendan Carney there, the former Chief of Staff of the US Marines, talking to us a little bit earlier on. Now then, plenty more on that breaking story, of course, as it develops through the morning. In the meantime, let's just get you up to date with some other news. And Israel will be forced to address accusations that it's committed genocide against Palestinians in Gaza today. It's the second day of a hearing at the United Nations International Court of Justice in a case brought by South Africa. Well, let's cross live to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who's in The Hague in the Netherlands for us now. And Dominic, tell us a little bit about what happened there yesterday in the first day of this hearing and what we can expect today.
Well, this was a historic hearing. It is a historic two-day hearing in which, for the first time, Israel, a nation founded in the aftermath of the worst genocide in history, is itself in court, in the World Court, as the International Court of Justice is called, defending itself against these allegations brought by South Africa that it is engaged itself in a genocide in Gaza. And its job today, its lawyers' turn in court today, is to push back against this claim launched by South Africa and made pretty forensically yesterday that it is involved in a deliberate attempt to eradicate the Palestinians of Gaza. I asked the South African Justice Minister yesterday if he personally believed that, and he said yes, he does. He believes that Israel is trying to wipe out the Palestinians in Gaza. And I think the problem for Israel today is that the South Africans were quite effective in preemptively seeing what the Israelis were planning to do and then seeing off that threat. So saying the Israelis are probably going to say they had to do this in self-defense. Well, if that's the case, why have 22,000 Palestinians died, the majority of them civilian men, women and children? And I think the weakest flank for the Israelis is these comments by everyone from the Israeli Prime Minister down that the South Africans say are inflammatory and genocidal, particularly the references made by the Israeli Prime Minister drawing on the passages of the scripture in which Jews in the Old Testament wiped out men, women and children and livestock of their enemies that the South Africans would say were acted on by their soldiers. So it's going to be a tough day for the Israelis in court, and there is a huge amount at stake, not just for Israel, but also by Britain and America, who say that the war in Gaza is necessary and is justified to see off the threat of Hamas. And the stakes have been raised, of course, by their airstrikes overnight, which will be seen by hundreds of millions of people across the region as America and Britain coming in a military sense now on the side of Israel.
OK, Dominic, there in The Hague. For the moment, thanks very much indeed. I know you'll bring us updates throughout the day, but thanks for now. Just a reminder, we're going to be talking to James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, shortly about those strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. But in the meantime, let's take a pause and find out what the weather's doing.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the weather looks settled and cold for now, but there's a chance of significant snow next week. It's a mostly dry and cold start with a widespread frost in the north. England, Wales and Ireland will be mostly overcast through the morning with just a few drizzly outbreaks possible.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Do stay with us. Coming up here on Sky News Breakfast, we'll have all the latest developments on the strikes on Yemen overnight. And I'll be talking to the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top story here this morning. And after overnight strikes in several Yemeni cities, Houthi fighters vow to continue their attacks on global trade routes in the Red Sea. But the UK's Ministry of Defence says the Houthis' ability to attack ships has been dealt a blow. And the US Air Force says the multinational force struck more than 60 targets at 16 sites in Yemen. The radar systems, air defence systems and storage and launch sites. And the US President Joe Biden says he will take further measures if he has to. Let's get more now on that International Court of Justice hearing today. Israel will be forced to address accusations that it's committed genocide against Palestinians in Gaza in that court today. Well, let's get a view on what's going on there. I'm joined now by human rights barrister Sir Geoffrey Nice. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. First of all, just how unusual is it for a case like this to be heard at the International Court of Justice? Has it considered allegations of genocide before?
Yes, there have been allegations of genocide and there have been cases where genocide has been proved in the past, including in Bosnia, for example. And then there's a pending case of Myanmar, which was brought to the court in a similar way to the way that South Africa has brought Israel to the court by way, first of all, seeking preliminary measures, protective measures in the way that's been applied for here, then moving on to a full hearing. So it's not entirely unusual. What is so interesting about this case is that whereas this is the sort of thing that should have been being done over the last 70 years whenever genocides have arisen by the big and powerful states such as our own, if we are big and powerful, perhaps we are small and powerful, or we're small and powerful, those states have never done it. And it's required, in the first place, the Gambia for Myanmar, and now South Africa, in respect of this war, to bring the matter to the court and to have it tested.
And how hard an allegation is it to prove in court, generally?
Well, proving genocide is obviously difficult in any court because you're looking at the established state of mind of the leadership and maybe other people in the chain, right down to the people who pull the trigger or send off the bomb. But that's not what's required at this stage. At this stage, because it's protective measures, the court is concerned to know whether there is evidence that may establish the crime of genocide and whether, if it doesn't act, rights under the Genocide Convention may be irretrievably lost to the parties. And that's a very different issue from the issue of whether the case is finally proved on all the evidence properly reviewed. So at this stage, it may be thought in general, without commenting on the merits of this particular case, because I don't want to comment on merits not for me, but in general, it's much easier to reach that required standard at this stage of a proceeding than at any later stage.
And what are the options at the end of proceedings? What does the court have the power to do?
Well, it has the power to make an order or several orders, and indeed several orders are sought, not just to stop the fighting, which is the principal order, but also other important orders such as preserving evidence, because in conflict, there's a great deal of evidence that may be available showing why one party did this or why one party did that. Before you let off a rocket these days, you're supposed probably to take or act on legal advice and to assess the collateral damage, all that sort of thing. But of course, it's all too easy with the passage of time for records that will show whether what you did was lawful by way of self-defense, as Israel be asserting today, I think, or whether it falls beyond the proportionality line and is a crime, or whether it's genocide. So it's all too easy for material not to be preserved. There's also a request, I know, that Israel reports to the court on what it's been doing and how it's been ensuring that the provisions of the Genocide Convention are being observed. So there are various orders sought, but the principal one, and the one that will stick in the public's mind if it is made, is an order to stop the fighting. Now, the consequence of that, or the consequences of such an order, were it to be made, are going to be different according to whether Israel obeys such an order or not. We're leaping rather a number of fences here. But in the past, Israel has not necessarily respected orders of the International Court of Justice. And it may well be the case that if such an order were to be made, about which I express no opinion at all really at the moment, but were such an order to be made and were Israel not to obey it, the consequences there are interesting and uncertain, including whether people would find it much harder thereafter to provide weaponry to Israel, and including whether the United States of America would take an even firmer view with Israel and about its conduct than it has done so far.
Well, Sir Geoffrey Nice, really interesting to get your take on what's going on in The Hague. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No problem, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Now then, Jackie's here. Good morning to you, Jackie.
Good morning.
Again, looking ahead to another busy weekend. What have you got for us this morning?
Yeah, well, I just thought the most interesting interview this morning was the British and Irish Lions' new head coach, Andy Farrell, was asked, will you pick your son to play on the tour if he moves to play in France? Now, if he does move to play in France, can't play for England, those are the rules. But there are no such rules for the British and Irish Lions. He went, yeah? If he's in form, I'll pick him, which is the correct answer. We're going to be talking about that, but also we're going to be talking about cricket.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Right, Alex Calvin, we've got AFCON around the corner, so thought we'd test out your knowledge with a little African player quiz, all about the Premier League. Alex with a slightly fresher trim today than Calvin. So you're already 1-0 up. Yeah, don't look at mine, mine's worse.
You're in it as well, man.
So we'll start off with games played. Just tell me if you could just read out the names actually, one of you that we got there.
Shola Miobi, Wilfred Zaha, Kolo Toure and Cheick Kouyaté.
So who do you think's got the most games played out of them four? We'll start with you, Calvin, go on.
Zaha for me.
You're going Zaha,
Yeah.
Calvin, Alex?
I'm gonna go Kolo.
Kolo, all right, reveal.
Come on, knowledge.
So we got here. We've got yellow cards. So we've got Cheick Kouyaté, Abdoulaye Doucouré, Wolf Zaha, and El Hadj Diouf.
Attacking players, because these three are attacking players. It's hard. I'm gonna go Tiote.
Okay.
Because he was a defensive
Yeah,
midfielder
made a lot
and he's
of
someone that.
tackles.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go Tiote.
Calvin?
I think he could shock us, you know.
Bro, something's telling me because look, there's referees in each picture. There's no referee there. I'm trying to look at it like that. Yeah, I'm trying to look at it like that.
I'm gonna say Diouf.
Have a look.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes!
What? I told you, trick question. Look at you going into
No
detail.
trick questions. No trick questions.
What?
Right. So
You think he'll be a defensive midfielder, but
is that 2-0? Goals.
Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, Didier Drogba, Emmanuel Adebayo.
Okay, legend there. Premier League legends, top goal scorers. What do you reckon?
Salah.
Yeah, I feel like it's gonna be more.
Yeah.
Excellent finish.
More Salah. Yeah, more Salah to be fair.
Yeah, both going Mo Salah.
Yeah.
There you go. Right, 2-2. Okay. So we've got assists here. So let me know who we got.
Mohamed Salah, Riyad Mahrez, Didier Drogba, Sadio Mane.
I'm gonna go Salah again, you know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go Salah again.
Calvin, what you saying?
Because his stats are outrageous.
Yeah.
But then Riyad,
I'm going Riyad Mahrez.
Let's have a look.
I knew it. Bro, his stats are outrageous. Lucas Radebe, Joseph Yobo, Lauren Kolo Toure.
Okay, so what are we thinking? These are clean sheets in the Premier League.
Clean sheets.
Kolo Toure. Invincibles.
Yeah,
Invincibles. That has to be. I'll be shocked. I'll be shocked. Has to be.
Nah, I'll be fuming.
Yeah, has to be.
That was a clean one.
He's a legend. He's a legend.
How much of a legend is he?
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Jackie, thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. Still to come here on Sky News Breakfast. We're going to have all the very latest on the developments overnight and those strikes on Yemen.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do. Just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, let's go back to our top story now. Those strikes on Yemen, or rather Houthi targets in Yemen overnight. Let's talk now to Deborah Haynes once again, but also we've got Michael Clark here with us as well, our security analyst, to talk about what's happened. And Deborah, we've had a lot of warnings in the last few days, the last few weeks, the last few months about these Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. So was it inevitable, given those warnings, that these attacks were going to happen?
It was, because a red line was crossed. And we know from 2013 with the war in Syria, when the red line was crossed by President Assad and the West didn't respond, that clearly they needed to respond this time. They put out a warning on the 3rd of January to the Houthis saying that you must stop these attacks against shipping in the Red Sea or else face the consequences. And then a couple of days ago, you'll remember the Defence Secretary was talking after the Houthis then ignored that warning, launched a barrage of drone and missile strikes against shipping, including HMS Diamond, a Type 45 destroyer that's been deployed to the Red Sea. The Defence Secretary saying, watch this space. And we very much watched this space overnight as these attacks were launched. Interesting that it's the US and the UK that actually carried out the strikes, but also supported by other militaries, including Australia, Bahrain, Canada as well. So they're very much trying to make out that this is a coalition effort protecting shipping in the Red Sea, while the Houthis are saying this is all about Israel's war in Gaza. They say that they launched these attacks in the first place back in October in the wake of that war, and saying that they will continue until Israel's war in Gaza stops.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that and the framing of this in a moment. But first, Michael, take us through what we know of what was targeted.
Yeah, it was a pretty big target set, according to CENTCOM, Central Command, the US Command. So they say 60 targets in 16 different locations, and 100 precision-guided munitions were used, missiles, or in Britain's case, Paveway 4 bombs. which are precise, but they're gravity bombs. I mean, but they are precise. So that was pretty big. And the targets that they're talking about generically were launching sites, storage sites, radar and air defence sites that the Houthis had. And that would be logical. You've got to take down the radars and the air defence before you move in with aircraft. And interestingly, you see, the British, they could have used Storm Shadow missiles, which would have allowed them to stand off anything up to 300 miles and just launch the cruise missile. But they didn't. Because they weren't dealing with a sophisticated air defence, they used Paveway 4, and that's a bomb you've got to drop. So the Typhoons, the FGR-4s that were used, had to actually fly over the target, Second World War style, and drop the bombs. And in order to do that, an awful lot of stuff will have been flying. I mean, 4 aircraft were the bombers, 4, but believe me, there would have been multiple aircraft around, so electronic warfare, jamming devices, airborne warning and control, and interestingly, the Voyager tankers, because the distance between Akrotiri in Cyprus, where they took off, and the sites in Yemen that they bombed, is about 1,600 miles. So 3,200 miles for a round trip. That's direct, even if you don't have to veer anywhere else, and some time over the target. So for that, you've got to be refueled. And, you know, any pilot will tell you that they're focused on the mission. They're not frightened of the safety isn't their problem. The problem is not doing the job. That's what they fear, that they mess up. But when they've dropped their bombs, done whatever it is, the best sight in the world is the Voyager tanker circling round, because that means they get fuel, then they get home. And that link up with the tankers is one of those things. Not all air forces do it, but the ability to refuel mid-air means that short-range aircraft can do long-range missions.
And you can see that's one of what you're looking at now. That's one of the, it's a video from inside a Typhoon jet as it's honing in on the target and then dropping the bombs. The MOD has released some images of the attack overnight.
And you know, Deborah, what's really interesting about that's the Paveway 4. But there's the image. The Typhoon is flying at whatever, 600, 700, 800 miles an hour. And yet that image is almost absolutely static. And so an aircraft can fly in a circle and the image is as if you're in a balloon above it. That's astonishing. And you can, I mean, we've seen it before. We've seen them looking at people on the ground, watching them walk around their vehicles. A surveillance Typhoon in Iraq, watching somebody walk around his vehicle, wondering if he's planting a bomb or not. And he's flying around 600-700 miles an hour in a circle, 8,000 feet above him. It's astonishing.
And we've had a response from the Houthis. They say that they're unrepentant, they're going to carry on their attacks on shipping. However, to what extent have these attacks, which the government, the military are saying are severely targeted, are very precisely targeted, how much will those attacks have limited their capabilities of carrying out further attacks on shipping?
Well, a source this morning was saying to me that the early indications are that the mission has been successful. It wasn't, of course, just the RAF in the sky. You had a number of American warplanes as well as warships and submarines launching precision-guided munitions against targets. They were taking out the Houthi launch sites, the storage facilities, the radar facilities to degrade their ability to strike. But the likelihood is that this one-off action isn't going to deter the Houthis from carrying out more. They've said that they're going to be targeting as well the British warships and other warships that are in the region. We've not seen anything yet, but that is clearly going to be an indicator. And then President Biden, in his statement announcing this military action overnight, warned that if the Houthis continue to strike, then more will be coming.
Yeah, well, yes. They'll be on full alert. All the warships in the Red Sea, absolute full alert, because they can expect the Houthis to launch some missiles just to show that they still can. And my guess would be, and we were talking about this earlier on, Deborah and I bet they'll launch quite a lot, not just one or two. I bet they'll try some sort of mass launch to prove that they can still do it. But when they do, they'll reveal where they're launching from and where they're getting them from, so they'll be hit again. I mean, I suspect this is the beginning of a campaign that will last several days.
And then the other thing to remember when this happens, though, is when you have militaries engaged in action, we say, obviously, Iran very much involved too, key backers of the Houthis, and the big concern is some kind of mistake, a miscalculation that then triggers some kind of uncontrolled escalation into regional war. Both sides have said that they do not want a direct confrontation between the West and Iran. But when you have this much military presence on the ground launching military attacks, you can't control every outcome.
Well, yes, and how great do you think, Michael, that risk of escalation is? And they talk about precision targeting, but what is the risk of civilian casualties, and how could that further inflame the situation?
Yeah, there always will be. And believe me, the targeting process that they go through is very detailed to try to minimise the possibility. One of the reasons that I was interested that the attack went in at 2:30 in the morning, Yemen time. I would have expected at 5 o'clock Yemen time. Pre-dawn is always a good time. But, that time in the dead of night is a time when fewer civilians will be around. People have not gone to the place of work. They've not got their stalls set up wherever it might be in Sana'a, the capital, or Hodeida in the port. So I suspect going earlier, which is a bit suboptimal from the point of view of the attackers, may be better for reducing any danger of civilian casualties. But, there is a justification. You say that if the target is really important, if you've taken all necessary reasonable measures to minimise the danger to civilians, then there's no legal or particularly big moral issue. But undoubtedly, the Houthis will say lots of civilians have been killed and this is dreadful. And this is dangerous stuff. All liberal democracies, when they resort to military force, by the time they get to military force, they're choosing the lesser evil out of several possible evils. So it's not easy being a democratic political leader.
OK, and it's going to be a really interesting few days ahead to see what the response is. But Michael and Deborah, for the moment, thanks both very much indeed. Let's find out now what's happening weather-wise.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the weather looks settled and cold for now, but there's a chance of significant snow next week. It's a mostly dry and cold start with a widespread frost in the north. England, Wales and Ireland will be mostly overcast through the morning with just a few drizzly outbreaks possible. Elsewhere, expect more in the way of sunshine, but fog will be slow to clear some spots while northwest Scotland will cloud over and it'll be cold again.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Do stay with us. We've got lots coming up for you in the next hour here on Sky News Breakfast with the latest developments on those strikes on Yemen. We'll be talking to both the Armed Forces Minister and Shadow Defence Secretary. Hello, a very good morning. It's 8 o'clock. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. And one story dominates this morning: the extensive strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen by the UK and the US, backed by a coalition of nations. Well, after continued attacks on Red Sea shipping, the West makes good on its warnings, switching from words to action. Well, we'll be talking to the Armed Forces Minister about the UK's involvement, and also to Labour, who say we back the action. It's Friday, the 12th of January. Well, after the overnight strikes in several Yemeni cities, Houthi militants vow to continue their attacks on global trade routes in the Gulf. Warships, fighter jets and Tomahawk missiles will analyse how the military action unfolded, as the MOD insists it was careful to minimise the risk to civilians.
Rishi Sunak is facing demands to recall Parliament after authorising what he says were necessary strikes taken in self-defence.
Iran and Hezbollah have both condemned the attack. Saudi Arabia says they're concerned about regional escalation, and Russia has called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council as these strikes threaten an already volatile region.
Britain increases its military funding for Ukraine, promising to provide the largest delivery of drones as the Prime Minister visits Kyiv. Also ahead, the public inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal continues as several more conviction appeals are heard for Scottish postmasters. The UK economy grew by more than expected in November, but the prospect of entering a recession at the end of the year still hangs in the balance.
And in sports, Colin Graves' expected return as Yorkshire chairman shows cricket is not safe for minority ethnic players, says racism whistleblower Asim Rafiq. And the new British and Irish Lions head coach, Andy Farrell, says the door is still open for his son Owen to play on next year's tour of Australia.
Hello, a very good morning and welcome to Sky News Breakfast. Well, words turned into action last night after the UK and US launched a series of joint strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. It follows continued attacks on Red Sea shipping by the militant group, disrupting global trade routes. So let's see now how that action unfolded overnight. Well, the US Air Force says it hit more than 60 targets across 16 sites in Yemen. There are reports of missiles hitting buildings in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, as well as Sada, Hodeidah, Taiz and Dhamma. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has our first report.
From an American warship in the Middle East, US jets on a mission which shifts the dial in a conflict they had sought to contain, but could not. One after the other from the aircraft carrier, they flew to the night skies above Yemen. The mission to hit Houthi military targets, to disrupt and degrade drone and missile sites, to stop Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in one of the world's busiest sea lanes. And this is what the overnight horizon in Yemen looked like, filmed by locals at several locations. This represents a new chapter, a new regional challenge, a long way from Gaza and Hamas. The US military says missiles were launched from planes, from ships and from submarines, and they claim multiple targets were hit. It was a US-led military operation, but supported by the British, who released footage said to be of their targets. It's not clear from this what was hit. We don't know what the collateral damage could have been, if any, but that is the big risk. 4 RAF Typhoon aircraft from a base in Cyprus joined the US Air Force for a mission which sources have said is expected to degrade Houthi capability in a significant way. There was no appearance by President Biden announcing the action, but a statement instead. He said these targeted strikes are a clear message that the United States and our partners will not tolerate attacks on our personnel or allow hostile actors to imperil freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical commercial routes. I will not hesitate to direct further measures to protect our people and the free flow of international commerce as necessary. For weeks now, Western navies have tried to deter Houthi forces who have sought to turn these sea routes into the Wild West. Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones and missiles targeting international shipping, shot down repeatedly by the British and the US military, but this deterrence has not worked.
America and Britain for a while have been warning about this, and I think they could not allow it to pass. I think that's the other side of it. You know, people talk about red lines and people like that, but it is important. If you say this is unacceptable and we're going to do something about it, at some point you have to back those words up with actions.
On the face of it, the weeks of Houthi attacks were in solidarity with the Gazans, the Palestinian flag here alongside their own on a ship which they took. But really, this is all about Iran, regional influence, testing the West, capitalizing on destabilization. The question, what now? A Houthi official said in a statement that the strikes represent a brutal aggression against our country, for which they will pay absolutely and without hesitation, and we will not back down from our position in supporting the Palestinian people, whatever the cost.
The risk remains that Iran may respond, and it may respond in an asymmetric fashion. That is to say, there were just reports today that Hezbollah was looking at attacks on U.S. interests outside of the Middle East. And so this may not simply be more missiles, more seizing of tankers in the Persian Gulf. It may indeed be another kind of threat.
And so a region already so acutely on edge is now braced once more. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, let's get the very latest now. Armed Forces Minister James Heappey joins me now. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us this morning. So bring us up to date on what happened overnight and why the UK took this action.
So I can confirm that 4 Royal Air Force Typhoon jets departed RAF Akrotiri at around 7:30 p.m. UK time yesterday. They were joined by 2 air-to-air refuelling tankers. All of those jets then proceeded south and took part in a set of coordinated strikes alongside the United States. The UK...
Well, apologies, we seem to have a problem. Apologies, James Heappey, we lost you just for a moment there. Pick up where you left off. We just obviously had a technical issue and the picture froze. Do continue.
So the jets proceeded south, prosecuted 2 targets, both of which have been used as launch sites for missiles and drones against shipping in the Red Sea. Our initial assessment is that both UK targets were successfully prosecuted. Indeed, our understanding is that all 14 targets that the US and UK prosecuted last night were successfully hit, and all UK jets involved in the mission were safely recovered to RAF Akrotiri by 0300 UK time this morning.
And what was the trigger for this action? What part did the seizure of a tanker by Iran yesterday play?
No, it's very, very important that your viewers understand that the reason for last night's action was self-defense. 2 nights ago, there were sustained attacks onto HMS Diamond, a Royal Navy destroyer that is currently in the southern Red Sea alongside 3 US Navy destroyers. All of those ships are in the region to provide, in turn, security for commercial shipping using this vital global trade route. And it was important, having warned the Houthis over a week ago, the UK, the US, and a large number of allies and partners, that we wouldn't stand for continued attacks on shipping. The attacks on the warships that are there to protect that shipping the other night meant that out of self-defense, we needed to degrade and destroy the Houthi capability, which is exactly what we sought to do last night.
So just to be clear on what the aim was, this is about degrading and destroying Houthi abilities to disrupt global shipping. Is it also, though, about simply enforcing that ultimatum that you issued at the beginning of the year and sending out a broader message to the Houthis?
Well, look, I mean, it's very, very important to stress that the attacks on warships the other night were the event that caused the US and the UK to respond as we have. It was an act of self-defense given those attacks on our warships. And it's important to remember why those warships are there in the first place. We cannot now, no matter what you think of the Houthi argument about their support for Hamas. We can't allow the Houthis to ransom the free flow of global trade in order to make that point. Those are international waters that must remain open and navigable to commercial shipping moving between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. So that is the significance of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the southern Red Sea. That is why warships are there in the first place. And the continued attacks on shipping and those warships were the cause for the strikes that you've been briefed about overnight.
How likely is it, though, that the strikes by the Houthis will stop? They've already this morning said that the targeting of ships heading towards Israel will continue. If there are more attacks by the Houthis, can we expect the UK to launch more action?
Well, it's important to stress that the Prime Minister hasn't taken a decision to launch any more strikes. But the warning that the UK, the US and other allies and partners made last week still stands, and the Houthis should take note of that.
So there is the possibility of further action beyond last night's strikes?
Of course, the UK is always going to act in self-defence and to protect our interests and the interests of our allies.
The UK has said it doesn't want to escalate the regional situation, but does this strike overnight risk doing just that, as it'll be perceived by some and certainly portrayed by the Houthis as the West intervening somehow on behalf of Israel, given that the Houthis have said that their attacks are in support of Hamas?
Well, I mean, the Houthis will craft whatever narrative that they wish, but fundamentally they need to understand that the warning that they were given around interfering with the free flow of global trade still stands and is meant, and they've seen that last night. You've also seen, I think, on your TV screens over the last few weeks, an intensive round of diplomacy with David Cameron and Tony Blinken, the UK and US foreign secretaries, constantly speaking to our partners and allies across the Middle East. It's also clear that there are countries in the region who are concerned about the risk of escalation, and they've said so overnight. And as sovereign countries, that's entirely their right to do so. But we've done everything that we can to understand their concerns, to talk to them about the way that we're seeing it, and to manage that escalation risk. And when the Prime Minister sat in Cobra and the National Security Council to consider these options, he was informed in the process by the brilliant analysis of our diplomatic network, our intelligence analysts, and of course our senior military. And he's very much trying to balance the need to protect our interests and to act in self-defense of the warships that are there to ensure freedom of navigation through those vital global trade routes, whilst also guarding against the risk of regional escalation.
Has Parliament been kept sufficiently informed of this action? The Defence Secretary suggested 2 days ago that action might well be imminent, but could a way not have been found for Parliament to debate this ahead of it happening?
Well, look, I think, Anna, if you think about what's implicit in your question, should we have had a big moment when at some length we warned the Houthis what was coming so that they could move all of their capabilities to a safer place in order to re-attack another day? No, absolutely not. That clearly makes no military sense whatsoever. It is unfortunate that the moment that was militarily expedient last night was on the eve of a day on which Parliament doesn't sit, because I know that colleagues around the House, quite legitimately, on behalf of their constituents, will want the opportunity to discuss and debate what has happened and to seek to understand the government's wider analysis on things like escalation, such as you've just asked me. But that moment will come on Monday. And in the meantime, both the Speaker of the House of Commons and the shadow front bench were briefed on Privy Council terms last night before the strikes went in, so that they were fully conversant and understanding of what we were doing and why.
How worried is the government about the economic impact of the disruption in the Red Sea? How much could this impact the UK economy?
Well, I think the government is very concerned about that. If your viewers might want to search on the internet for sort of global shipping trackers. And what they will see is this ant trail of ships moving between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Normally, those ships proceed directly across the Indian Ocean and up through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the choke point at the bottom end of the Red Sea, up through the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. That is the quickest shipping route between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. What they will see if they go to those ship tracking websites now is that all global trade is currently proceeding around the south of Africa, around the Horn, which is the longest way. Now, the impact of that is ships go out of position, shipping costs increase, and supply chains become disrupted. And on the back of a period of time where, as a consequence of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, global supply chains have been disrupted with all of the impact that we've seen on inflation and prices and cost of living, it's of course a concern to see this vital global artery, Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the southern Red Sea, be disrupted in the way that the Houthis have over the last few weeks. And that's why the Royal Navy and the US Navy have such a strong naval presence in the region. And out of self-defense for that naval task force, that's why we did the strikes that we did last night.
OK, well, James Heappey, Armed Forces Minister, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for filling us in on the events overnight. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get some immediate reaction now. With me is the Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us today. Does Labour back the government in these strikes that were carried out overnight in Yemen?
Yes, we back the targeted action. It was designed to protect shipping in the Red Sea and to maintain the freedom of navigation in that region. We back it just like we backed the UK participation in the Maritime Protection Force with a dozen other nations last month.
There will be many in your party who are concerned about the fact this has gone ahead without any kind of vote or parliamentary discussion. Former Chancellor John MacDonald said there should be no military action without parliamentary approval. If we've learnt anything in recent years, it's that military intervention in the Middle East always has dangerous and often unforeseen consequences. There's a risk of setting the region alight. What do you say to him and other concerned colleagues?
Everybody's concerned when a country and a Prime Minister commit armed forces to military action. It's a grave decision. We accept this, however, was limited action overnight. We accept that the timing was not in the hands of the UK government, and what we expect now is the Prime Minister to come to the House of Commons at the earliest opportunity on Monday to explain what the action aims to do, how protection for the freedom of navigation can be maintained, and of course where the steps that are being taken to guard against a wider escalation may lie as well.
Would you have liked Parliament to be recalled earlier than Monday, and do you think that a vote should happen retrospectively on this?
Well, we understand that the action that's been authorised has been completed. So in those circumstances, as things stand, we want to hear from the Prime Minister. We want to hear him elaborate on what his aims are, what the risks and consequences may be, and it seems sensible to do that at the first opportunity on Monday, rather than bring everyone back over the weekend.
What consultation was there with Labour ahead of these attacks?
Well, as you heard from the Armed Forces Minister, Keir Starmer as Labour leader and I as the Defence Secretary, alongside the Speaker, were briefed yesterday evening just before the strikes took place. We now need to hear, and the public need to hear in Parliament, the Prime Minister explaining more fully what's behind these strikes, and in particular, the way that the important principle of international trade routes and the freedom of navigation can be maintained. That's of interest not just to the UK and the US that, of course, conducted the strikes last night, supported by 4 other nations, but it's a concern of the dozen or so nations that are part of the protection force in the Red Sea, and many other nations, including the UN Security Council this week, that have condemned these Houthi attacks as illegal, demanded that they must stop, and warned, of course, about the consequences if the Houthis will not stop these attacks.
Well, yes, and if there are further strikes by the Houthis on shipping in the Red Sea, would Labour support further attacks by the UK on Houthi targets?
Well, let's see what the Houthis do rather than what they say. what's important is that there is, across the world, this international condemnation of attacks on both commercial and military shipping. The principle that our international waters must be free for navigation is fundamental to all nations. And this is a trading route which carries almost 15% of the world's seaborne trade. So it has huge consequences for all countries. And that's why we've seen the UN Security Council behind the condemnation, demanding these attacks must stop. And the action that we took alongside the US was designed to reinforce that international will.
How worried are you about escalation? Because the Houthis have associated their strikes on ships in the Red Sea with the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. They say they're attacking ships connected to Israel. So isn't there a risk by carrying out these strikes that you're somehow getting involved in that war? That could be the perception on the outside. Is there a risk then of escalation?
Well, Houthis may say that. The truth is that these are not tied to the Israel-Gaza conflict at all. They're directed to the attacks that the Houthis have directed, both at commercial shipping and at some of the naval ships in the area, trying to protect that shipping. Drones, ballistic missiles, attack boats. These are illegal. No country, as we've seen through the UN Security Council and the widespread condemnation, can accept that, which is why the warnings have been issued to the Houthis, and we expect them now to step back from further attacks.
The government has been clear that they believe that Iran is behind these Houthi attacks. Do you expect Iran to take some form of action?
It's indisputable that the Houthis are trained and equipped by Iran. It's less clear that they're directed by Iran. The Houthis are fiercely independent as well as being very aggressive. The diplomacy behind the military action is just as important. And it's one of the things that I'm sure the House of Commons will want to hear from the Prime Minister on Monday, what steps the government is taking to reduce and try and manage the risks of wider escalation, as well as to try and maintain this very important freedom of international shipping and trade through this vital trade route.
Well, yes, and you talk about it being a vital trade route. What's your concerns about the economic impact of what's been going on in the Red Sea? Because, as you say, it's a crucial shipping lane that many ships have had to avoid because of the risk of attack.
That's true. The major shipping companies have all stopped using this route. That requires them to reroute round the bottom of Africa. It can add up to 2 weeks to a voyage, lots of cost, which ultimately will feed into inflation, and we will all pay that as consumers.
OK, well, John Healey, Shadow Defence Secretary, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Now then, in a moment, we're going to hear from Alistair Bunkle, our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. But let's get analysis from Mark Stone in DC and also Rob Powell, who's outside number 10 for us. In fact, Rob, we're going to come to you first of all. And firstly, what is the Prime Minister saying about these attacks overnight?
Yeah, well, the announcement was initially made by the Prime Minister at about 12:30 last night. He described them as proportionate, as necessary, as limited attacks. And I thought you got some more specific detail from James Heapy, the Ministry of Defence Minister, there, talking about how jets took off from Cyprus at 7:30 p.m. UK time last night. That was shortly before Rishi Sunak briefed not just the Cabinet, but also the Leader of the House of Commons and the Shadow Defence Secretary and Labour leader as well. I thought what was interesting about that interview with the Minister too was when you pressed him on the precise reasons for these strikes, whether it was tied up with a tanker being seized by the Iranians yesterday, he was very keen to try and take the context or take the emphasis off the context of Iran and also of Israel, Hamas as well. Alistair will talk more about the global context in the Middle East, but clearly those contexts are relevant. What the UK is clearly trying to do, though, is make this specifically a response to the attacks that we saw on warships 2 days ago, the UK and US ships having to repel missiles being fired by Houthi rebels, and also about the attacks that the Houthis have been waging against international shipping in the region too. In terms of what happens here in Westminster now, James Heapy said that whilst it was unfortunate that the timing of this attack and these strikes happened ahead of a day when Parliament is not sitting, MPs are not here in Westminster today to discuss it, he said it clearly wouldn't have been a good idea for them to be a big moment to essentially warn the Houthi rebels, that an attack was coming and allow them to move resource around. He suggested that there would be no recall of Parliament over the weekend. I think we sort of knew that already, that Monday would be the day where this was debated. I understand there probably won't be a vote on this either. In terms of Labour, you have the Shadow Defence Secretary there saying that Labour backs this. So even if there was a vote, that would be a formality because Labour would be behind this in the whole anyway. You would likely have more members of the Labour Party with concerns over this. And Labour seem fairly happy as well about the timing of all of this, saying that they now want to see the Prime Minister coming to the Commons at the earliest possible opportunity on Monday to explain what the broader plan is and what success looks like. But I thought the Minister was very clear in that interview with you that the UK clearly does not rule out being involved in further action if these attacks from the Houthis do not stop.
And in the meantime, the Prime Minister is not in number 10 behind you, is he? He's actually in Kyiv just hours after these strikes. They're announcing more funding for the country. What can you tell us about that visit?
Yeah, so a series of late-night briefings on the Middle East last night for the Prime Minister, and then shortly after, in the early hours of the morning, he departed for Kyiv. We're expecting to see him there later today. What the UK is announcing is a new major increase in funding, military funding for Ukraine. That will be taken to £2.5 billion in the next financial year, including the biggest commitment to drones. There will also be a signing between Rishi Sunak and President Zelensky of a UK-Ukraine security cooperation partnership. This builds on commitments that were made by G7 countries to Ukraine not long ago. The UK says it's the first to deliver on this. It will involve intelligence sharing, training, industrial support as well. And the UK saying that it wants this to be the first step in a 100-year security cooperation. So clearly, amid events and focus elsewhere in the world, the UK is still keen to show it stands behind Ukraine, and Rishi Sunak making that visit to Kyiv today.
OK, Rob, thanks for that. Well, let's talk to Mark Stone then, who's in Washington for us. And of course, we've heard there about the UK's thinking behind these strikes, Mark, but it was done in conjunction, of course, with America. So what's being said there?
Well, look, I think it's clear, having listened and spoken to a briefing last night from here in Washington from a senior administration official, spoken to sources too, that the Americans, and I'm assuming the British as well, are under no illusions that one night of airstrikes against the Houthis is not going to bring an end to these attacks that we've seen in the Red Sea and disrupting international shipping. They know that, but they also knew that they had to carry out the attacks because of their own credibility, apart from anything else. You don't set red lines and then allow them to be crossed without doing anything. And so they have had to act. But they know, given the history of the Houthis, given that the Saudis, for example, have been fighting the Houthis for years in Yemen, and yet the Houthis have been able to continue to attack Saudi Arabia. I remember being at a Saudi oil plant in northern Saudi Arabia a few years ago now, which was hit by drones, by Houthi drones, after the Saudis had assumed that they'd managed to thwart these attacks. They weren't able to. So the Houthi force is a very capable force. So the danger is mission creep. The Houthis will continue to carry out attacks. It's kind of baked in to the Western assumptions. But what do they do then? The other concern, of course, is civilian casualties. As you bomb a country, as the Americans and the British did last night, the risk of civilian casualties is there. And and that only compounds a very, very dangerous situation indeed. So this is a dangerous moment, yet another dangerous moment in this conflict, which seems to have different ways in which it could spiral all the time.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. And let's pick up that point with Alistair Bunkle there about just how dangerous a moment this might be. Alistair, the government here very keen to stress that these were targeted attacks in self-defence after strikes on their own shipping in the Red Sea. However, how great is the fear there of an increase in tensions at what's already a very volatile time?
Well, the reasons the Houthis were carrying out attacks on shipping in the Red Sea was in support of Hamas in its fight against Israel. But frankly, the Houthis were not targeting ships that had direct connections to Israel. They were threatening ships from all over the world, and that was having a huge impact on global trade. And so that is why America and the UK felt compelled to get involved. And I would completely agree with what Mark said. I would expect the Houthis to launch further attacks to show that they have not had their capabilities to do so damaged to such an extent that they are no longer able to carry out those attacks. So I think there will be more attacks, and we'll have to see how, if and when Britain, America and others respond to that. In terms of what could happen around the wider region, well, as I said, this all started because of the Israel-Hamas war, but Hamas has been degraded very sufficiently in the Gaza Strip to the extent where I don't see any kind of significant retaliation from them. I mean, they're frankly just too busy fighting Israel. Hezbollah are the one to watch out for. They are really Iran's biggest proxy, best armed proxy. But at the same time, Hezbollah has very carefully calibrated its response to the Israel-Hamas war, has not wanted to get involved in a full-scale war with Israel. And so will they really choose this moment in order to escalate it further? I don't think so.
OK, well, Alistair, certainly one to watch very carefully over the hours and days ahead. Thanks very much indeed. Alistair Bunkle there in Jerusalem for us. Thank you. Now then, plenty more on this story, of course, throughout the morning. Right now, though, let's find out what the weather's doing.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the weather looks settled and cold for now, but there is a chance of significant snow next week. It's a mostly dry and cold start with a widespread frost in the north. England, Wales and Ireland will be mostly overcast through the morning.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Do stay with us. Coming up here on Sky News Breakfast, we'll have all the very latest developments as British and American forces launch missile strikes at targets across Yemen. Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top story here today. And after overnight strikes in several Yemeni cities, Houthi fighters vow to continue their attacks on global trade routes in the Red Sea. But the UK's Ministry of Defence says the Houthis' ability to attack ships has been dealt a blow. And the US Air Force says the multinational force struck more than 60 targets at 16 sites in Yemen. Missiles were fired at radar systems, air defence systems and storage and launch sites. And the US President Joe Biden says he'll take further measures if he has to. And let's just get you up to date with the latest on those strikes, because a spokesperson for the Houthi group has said in the last few minutes that the US and British forces attacked Yemen with 73 strikes, is their analysis. They say that the strikes killed 5 fighters and wounded 6 others. They've also gone on to say that the US-British attack will not go without a response or punishment. And they say they'll continue to prevent Israeli ships or other ships going to Israel from passing through the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. So a defiant message from the Houthis this morning saying that the attacks overnight will not go without a response or punishment, and that they plan to continue to prevent, as they put it, Israeli ships or other ships going to Israel from passing through the Red Sea or the Arabian Sea. Plenty more on that story, of course, throughout the morning. In the meantime, though, let's get you up to date with some other breaking news that we had in the last hour, and that is that the UK economy grew by a bit more than expected in November last year. UK GDP grew by 0.3% in November. That's compared to October, where it contracted by 0.3%. So let's speak to our business correspondent, Ian King, who joins me now. So, Ian, good news or not a huge amount to shout about, given that these are very low figures?
Well, you have to put them in the broader context, Anna, which is that during the 3 months to the end of November, the economy contracted by 0.2% from 3 months to August. So in that context, you could say it was rather disappointing. Bear in mind that the economy contracted by 0.1% in the third quarter of this year. So as things stand, the UK economy on track for a technical recession, albeit a very, very shallow one. Now, bear in mind that figures are often prone to revision, and that third quarter number at 0.1% in particular looks as though it might be revised higher at some point in the near future. But in the meantime, a reasonably robust showing in November. Most of the heavy lifting was done by the services sector, which of course accounts for 80% or so of UK GDP. The services sector during the month expanded by 0.4%. That was due to retail sector, by and large, consumer-facing industries. Retail sector, obviously, you had the Black Friday promotional period at the end of November, which is always very popular. We've heard anecdotally from retailers such as Boots and Currys, for example, that they had very robust trade during that particular promotional period. Computer games was another positive spot as well. Elsewhere, production, which includes manufacturing, that expanded by 0.3% during the month. That was significantly better than a contraction of 1.3% in October. Construction also did better than in the previous month. It still contracted by 0.4%, but that was up from 0.2%. That was up from a contraction of 0.4% in October. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, saying weather played a part there. So, I mean, on the whole, the number for November was better than expected, but that 3 months to November, still pretty disappointing.
OK, Ian, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Now, the public inquiry resumes this morning into the post office scandal that led to the wrongful convictions of more than 900 branch managers. And the cases of several postmasters will be heard in Scotland today, where appeals against convictions are also underway. So let's get a close-up legal perspective on what we've seen and heard so far. Sam Fowles is a barrister, author and columnist who was involved in some of the cases that went to the Court of Appeal. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for coming in. So tell us a little bit about your involvement with some of the victims of this post office scandal and how that affects your take on what's happened this week.
Well, my involvement was with a number of sub-postmasters in the Criminal Court of Appeal. And so that was in 2021 when the Criminal Court of Appeal overturned the convictions of 39 sub-postmasters. I was brought in to argue a particular point, which was not simply that the sub-postmasters had not had a fair trial, and the Post Office admitted that they hadn't had a fair trial because they'd not had all of the evidence disclosed to them. But to go a step further and say that the Post Office was wrong in the way it used its investigative powers to pursue sub-postmasters and to conceal the problems with Horizon. And what the court found was a quite dramatic and very, very ancient use of words, which is it offends the conscience of the court that this matter was brought before it. And that's been a form of words that's been kicking around since the 18th century. But it's really the highest criticism that a court can confer on a prosecutor. And it means it's not just you didn't have a fair trial, you might be guilty, you might be innocent, but we don't know. It's you are 100% exonerated and should never have been tried for this in the first place.
Well, yes, and so given that, is it interesting that with the public inquiry, which has been going on for some time, but the real focus now is on it in the light of the ITV drama and the fallout and the government action since, but the focus really on how the investigations were carried out?
That's absolutely right. And that's the real scandal, if you like, certainly, because that's the thing that really impacted on individual people's lives. And, you asked me how this affects me, and I certainly don't consider myself the sort of barrister that gets emotional in court, but I certainly got emotional on this one, and I've felt very emotional about it the whole time, because this is individual people's lives that were ruined by this. And one of my clients was convicted when she was barely into her 20s, and that was her whole life with her conviction hanging over her. And it's quite right that the inquiry now is looking at the way the Post Office conducted the investigations. And we saw yesterday one of the Post Office's investigators being questioned and admitting that he effectively wasn't just trying to find the truth, he was trying to cover up the problems with Horizon.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if he went as far as... He certainly said he didn't think he'd done anything wrong, did he? But also, what do you make of how the government has proceeded this week? They're talking about exonerations en masse. Is that the right way to go, do you think?
I don't think it is. Obviously, emotionally, I desperately want all of these people to be cleared as quickly as possible. But there are bigger issues at play here. It's when you get to questions of justice, of guilt and innocence, those need to be decided by courts on the basis of facts, not by politicians on the basis of political convenience. And we've got to be honest here. Rishi Sunak and the government knew about these issues, certainly from 2021, arguably from 2019. They're acting on it now because it's good politics. And that's not a good way to run a justice system.
It may be good for politics, but is it good for the individuals concerned? They will at least get speedy justice.
There's already ways that they should be getting speedy justice. The Criminal Cases Review Commission and the Court of Appeal have the power to review these cases and give them justice. It's taking too long at the moment, but the reason for that is because the same ministers who are proposing this plan cut the Criminal Cases Review Commission in real terms by 60% over the last 10 years. And what really worries me about this isn't just the good cause that it's being used in now. It's that it creates a precedent for politicians to step into the role of the courts and compromise the independence of the courts. And we're already seeing politicians trying to do this. For example, the Rwanda bill is about politicians dictating what the courts have to believe is true and what the courts have to believe is false. We're seeing the same thing here. And it's a real danger because the courts are the ultimate guarantee of individual rights and individual liberties, and that's vital for democracy.
OK, Sam Faust, thanks very much indeed for coming in and giving us your take on an extraordinary week in this ongoing scandal. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's just get your takes with some of the other headlines around today. And the NHS has been criticised for allowing some hospitals to pay double the price for medical equipment compared with others. The service spends around £8 billion a year on medical supplies, but more than a third is spent by trusts independently. The spending watchdog says that hospitals need to do a better job of controlling their finances by purchasing products through the organisation's central supply chain. Now then, Jackie's back with all the sport. Hello to you. And a bit of a focus on the rugby today.
There is, but I want to start with a story that's not in my bulletin, but I love it. I love it so much. So Rob Burrow and Kevin Sinfield, and we've got the picture, and there's a bit of flash photography coming up in those pictures, were awarded their CBEs by Prince William yesterday. It's in all the papers today, and you have to think Prince William's a pretty good egg to travel up to their dressing room at Leeds Rhinos, but he did, and they so deserve it. They have raised £50 million since Rob's diagnosis back in 2019, and it's so needed for motor neuron disease because there's been no change in treatment of it forever. And actually that is beginning to change. There's more trials going on. And because, these guys are highlighting it all the time, and Doddy Weir did the same, I think things are changing. And I just think that's just so brilliant.
And they're such an inspiring pair, aren't they? Because they're obviously so close. There's so much love there. They are extraordinary.
So much love that he carries them over the line in the marathons. It's an unbelievable story. However, not in the bulletin, but you saw it there. Let's have a quick look at what is going on in the world of sport this morning.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Right, Alex Calvin, we've got AFCON around the corner, so thought we'd test out your knowledge with a little African player quiz, all about the Premier League. Alex with a slightly fresher trim today than Calvin. So you already 1-0 up. Yeah, don't look at mine, mine's worse.
You're in it as well, man.
So we'll start off with games played. Just tell me if you could just read out the names actually, one of you that we got there.
Shola Miobi, Wilfred Zaha, Kolo Toure and Cheick Kouyaté.
So who do you think's got the most games played out of them four? We'll start with you, Calvin, go on.
Zaha for me.
You're going Zaha,
yeah.
Calvin, Alex?
I'm going to go Kolo.
Kolo, all right, reveal.
Come on, knowledge.
So we got we've got yellow cards. So we've got Cheick Kouyaté, Abdoulaye Doucouré, Wolf Zaha and El Hadj Diouf.
Attacking players, because these three are attacking players. It's hard. I'm going to go Tiote.
Okay.
Because he was a defensive midfielder and he's someone that, so I'm going to go Tiote.
Karen?
I think he could shock us, Bro, something's telling me because look, there's referees in each picture. There's no referee there. Yeah. I'm trying to look at it like that. Yeah, I'm trying to look at it like that. I'm going to say Diouf.
Have a look.
Yeah. Oh, yes. What? I told you, trick question. Look at you going into detail.
No trick questions.
What?
Right, so
I don't think he'll be a defensive midfielder, but...
Is that 2-0? Goals.
Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, Didier Drogba, Emmanuel Adebayo.
Okay, legend there, Premier League legends, top goal scorers. What do you reckon?
Salah? Yeah, I feel like it's going to be more. Yeah. Excellent finish. More Salah. Yeah, more Salah to be fair.
Yeah, both going Mo? Mo Salah?
Yeah.
There you go, right, 2-2, okay. So we've got assists here. So let me know who we got.
Mohamed Salah, Riyad Mahrez, Didier Drogba, Sadio Mane. I'm going to go Salah again,
Yeah?
I'm going to go Salah again.
Calvin, what are you saying?
Because these stats are outrageous. Yeah. But then Riyad, I'm going Riyad Mahrez.
Let's have a look.
I knew it. Bro, his stats are outrageous. Lucas Radebe, Joseph Yobo, Lauren Kolo Toure.
Okay, so what are we thinking? These are clean sheets in the Premier League.
Clean sheets. Kolo Toure. Invincibles. Invincibles. That has to be. I'll be shocked. I'll be shocked. Has to be. Nah, I'll be fuming. Yeah, has to be. That was a clean one. He's a legend. He's a legend of
Yobo.
country, yeah.
So what? How much of a legend is he, Yobo?
Like, probably one of the best defenders in Nigeria.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest.
Do you think sometimes players are like?
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Jackie, thanks very much indeed. Still to come here on Sky News Breakfast, we're going to be speaking to a retired senior British Army officer about last night's action.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do. Just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's go back now to our top story and the joint missile strikes by the US and the UK last night on Houthi targets in Yemen. I can speak now to Major General Rupert Jones, a retired senior British Army officer. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. The UK and the US have been long warning the Houthis to stop their strikes on shipping in the Red Sea, or there would be some kind of retaliation. So are you surprised that we saw these strikes overnight?
I'm not surprised. I mean, the Grant Shapps and others gave plenty of warning that this was coming. So I don't think it was a great surprise. Still a very significant decision by President Biden and our Prime Minister to take the action. But there was plenty of signalling to suggest it was coming, and absolutely essential that we maintain freedom of navigation through the Red Sea.
And I was speaking to the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, earlier, and he described these strikes as limited and proportionate, as well as being a necessary response in self-defence. And he said that no further strikes were planned, but didn't rule out the possibility in future. Do you expect there to be more action taken by the UK in this area?
I suspect that there will be a pause now to see how the Houthis respond. But if they continue to attack shipping, if they continue to attack military vessels that are protecting shipping, then I would expect there to be a further round. But what they will be hoping is that a quick strike overnight will have degraded the Houthis' ability to mount these sort of attacks, but more importantly, that will have deterred the Houthis from mounting these sorts of attacks.
And certainly the initial signs are that they're not deterred. The messages they're putting out are that they will continue their strikes on shipping in the Red Sea. Given that, how great do you think the risk of escalation is in an already volatile part of the world?
Well, everybody has been running a very tightrope walk since October the 7th. The Iranians have with their proxies, the Americans have, we have, to try and avoid genuine escalation. I don't think that's in anyone's interest. I don't think it's in the Iranians' interests. So, of course, there is some risk of escalation, but the Americans and the British and others will be calibrating their actions very, very carefully. They're not trying to destroy the Houthi forces across the board. What they're trying to do is degrade their ability to conduct drone and missile strikes into the Red Sea, and to send a message to the Houthis that this sort of attack will not be tolerated.
And very briefly, what do you think success looks like for the British government?
I mean, success ultimately is freedom of navigation being re-established in the Red Sea, and international shipping companies sending all their shipping through that route, such that the global economy is not impacted. That's success.
OK, well, General Rupert Jones, we really appreciate your time this morning and your analysis of what's happened overnight. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
And of course, we'll have lots more on this in the next hour here on Sky News Breakfast. Plenty of analysis and all the latest developments on those strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. Hello, a very good morning. It's 9 o'clock. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. And one story dominates this morning: the extensive strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen by the UK and the US, backed by a coalition of nations. After continued attacks on Red Sea shipping, The West makes good on its warning, switching from words to action. Well, this hour we'll hear from the Liberal Democrats after Labour backed the action, and we'll talk to Lord Ricketts, Britain's first national security advisor. It's Friday, the 12th of January. Well, after the overnight strikes in several Yemeni cities, Houthi militants vow to continue their attacks on global trade routes in the Gulf. Warships, fighter jets and Tomahawk missiles will analyse how the military action unfolded, as the MOD insists it was careful to minimise the risk to civilians.
Rishi Sunak says the strikes were taken in self-defence as his Armed Forces Minister leaves open the possibility of further action.
The Prime Minister hasn't taken a decision to launch any more strikes, but the warning that the UK, the US and other allies and partners made last week still stands.
Iran and Hezbollah have both condemned the actions. Saudi Arabia says that they are concerned of the conflict spreading, and Russia has called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council.
Britain increases its military funding for Ukraine, promising to provide the largest delivery of drones as the Prime Minister visits Kyiv. Also ahead, the public inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal continues as several more conviction appeals are heard for Scottish postmasters. UK economy grew by more than expected in November, but the prospect of entering a recession at the end of the year still hangs in the balance.
And in sport, Colin Graves' expected return as Yorkshire chairman shows cricket is not safe for minority ethnic players, says racism whistleblower Azim Rafiq. And the new British and Irish Lions head coach, Andy Farrell, says the door is still open for his son Owen to play on next year's tour to Australia. Hello, very good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Now, words turned to action last night after the UK and US launched a series of joint strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. It follows continued attacks on Red Sea shipping by the militant group, disrupting global trade routes. So let's take a look now at how that action unfolded overnight. Well, the US Air Force says it hit more than 60 targets across 16 sites in Yemen. There are reports of missiles hitting buildings in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, as well as in Sada, Hodeidah, Taiz and Dhamma. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has our first report.
From an American warship in the Middle East, US jets on a mission which shifts the dial in a conflict they had sought to contain, but could not. One after the other from the aircraft carrier, they flew to the night skies above Yemen. The mission to hit Houthi military targets, to disrupt and degrade drone and missile sites, to stop Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in one of the world's busiest sea lanes. And this is what the overnight horizon in Yemen looked like, filmed by locals at several locations. This represents a new chapter, a new regional challenge, a long way from Gaza and Hamas. The US military says missiles were launched from planes, from ships and from submarines, and they claim multiple targets were hit. It was a US-led military operation, but supported by the British, who released footage said to be of their targets. It's not clear from this what was hit. We don't know what the collateral damage could have been, if any, but that is the big risk. 4 RAF Typhoon aircraft from a base in Cyprus joined the US Air Force for a mission which sources have said is expected to degrade Houthi capability in a significant way. There was no appearance by President Biden announcing the action, but a statement instead. He said these targeted strikes are a clear message that the United States and our partners will not tolerate attacks on our personnel or allow hostile actors to imperil freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical commercial routes. I will not hesitate to direct further measures to protect our people and the free flow of international commerce as necessary. For weeks now, Western navies have tried to deter Houthi forces who have sought to turn these sea routes into the Wild West. Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones and missiles targeting international shipping, shot down repeatedly by the British and the US military, but this deterrence has not worked.
America and Britain for a while have been warning about this, and I think they could not allow it to pass. I think that's the other side of it. People talk about red lines and people like that, but it is important. If you say this is unacceptable and we're going to do something about it, at some point you have to back those words up with actions.
On the face of it, the weeks of Houthi attacks were in solidarity with the Gazans, the Palestinian flag here alongside their own on a ship which they took. But really, this is all about Iran, regional influence, testing the West, capitalising on destabilisation. The question, what now? A Houthi official said in a statement that the strikes represent a brutal aggression against our country, for which they will pay absolutely and without hesitation, and we will not back down from our position in supporting the Palestinian people, whatever the cost.
The risk remains that Iran may respond, and it may respond in an asymmetric fashion. That is to say, there were just reports today that Hezbollah was looking at attacks on U.S. interests outside of the Middle East. And so this may not simply be more missiles, more seizing of tankers in the Persian Gulf. It may indeed be another kind of threat.
And so a region already so acutely on edge is now braced once more. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, let's delve into these strikes a little bit further. I'm joined now by our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Hello to you, Michael. So tell us a little bit about what these strikes look like.
Yeah, this is for the military train spotters out there. So we know that American aircraft were used from the Eisenhower, the carrier, the Eisenhower, which were the F-18 Super Hornets. So they will have launched missiles. The British aircraft were the FGR-4 Typhoons, the bomber version of the Typhoon, and 4 of those were over the target, so they, rather than release missiles from a distance, they were using Paveway 4 bombs, which are very accurate to the penetrative, but the aircraft's got to actually go over the target to do that. And that's a pretty complex operation, and obviously there's a certain amount of danger involved.
Yeah, and British planes obviously involved as well.
Yeah, the Typhoons, FGR-4s, they were from Akrotiri in Cyprus. And
that's a long way away, isn't it?
Yeah,
Cyprus.
it's 1,600 miles. I checked it out last night. And so the round trip, even if there's no diversions, and that allows for some diversion over the target, is 3,200 miles. That's like flying across the Atlantic. So for that, they have to be refueled. And the Voyager tanker, at least one, maybe more than one, was in the air. And believe me, I mean, pilots will always say, they go on their mission, they do their job. They are so glad on their way back to see the refueling aircraft, circling around very slowly, and they lock onto it, they get the fuel. That means they will get home. And the best sight in the world for a fighter pilot is the air-to-air refueler. Yep, that's it, that's the Voyager.
Yeah, that's the Voyager there. So that's what's happened from the air. What about from the sea? Because there are a number of vessels in the region, aren't there?
Yeah, with the HMS Diamond, which is a Type 45 destroyer, which has been doing a lot of the defensive work, is there. HMS Lancaster, Type 23 frigate, is there as well. HMS Richmond is on its way. That's the Richmond, I think. Previous still, I think, was the Lancaster. And those ships are, the Richmond's on its way, the other 2 ships are in the area. They didn't participate in the attack itself because they don't have the sort of munitions to fire off. The Americans fired off Tomahawk missiles, which they have on their ships and on their submarines. But those ships that we have in the area, they'll be on full alert. And that means the whole crew, 200 other crew, in their flash suits and their flash hoods, and they'll be waiting and expecting maybe some sort of response from the Houthis. The official line from the British government is that this is a one-off. It was necessary, proportionate, and now it's finished. It's over. That's fine. But if the Houthis respond, as I suspect they will, with probably to show that they can, and they'll probably fire off quite a lot of stuff, missiles and drones, in the next, whatever, half a day, 2 days, then I'm sure we'll have to respond again. So this may be a one-off as far as we're concerned. I doubt if it'll be a one-off as far as the Houthis are concerned.
And what does that mean? Does that risk the UK getting dragged into a longer conflict, into a bigger conflict?
Well, not necessarily bigger, but sort of more of it. I mean, I would expect, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but I would expect that the Houthis will respond, that there'll be more attacks. that we will conduct more attacks and we'll have to defend shipping in the Red Sea in the way that we've done last week, we and the Americans. And President Biden made it clear. He said this is a one-off, but we'll do it again if we have to. And I think the British and the Americans and the other members of this 13-nation coalition now, this International Maritime Task Force, will have to do it again. And remember, quite important point, they are backed up by a very strongly worded Security Council resolution from 48 hours ago. And that resolution called upon the Houthis to stop it. It implicitly criticised Iran, who are behind the Houthis, and it asserted the right of freedom of navigation and the right to defend the freedom of navigation by military means. So, in a way, there's a pretty strong UN Security Council resolution backing up what this coalition is about to do. OK,
Michael, thanks very much indeed. So let's hear what the government did have to say about it, because this morning I asked the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey about it, and he told us why the government decided to strike without a parliamentary debate.
It is unfortunate that the moment that was militarily expedient last night was on the eve of a day on which Parliament doesn't sit, because I know that colleagues around the House, quite legitimately, on behalf of their constituents, will want the opportunity to discuss and debate what has happened and to seek to understand the government's wider analysis on things like escalation, such as you've just asked me. But that moment will come on Monday. And in the meantime, both the Speaker of the House of Commons and the shadow front bench were briefed on Privy Council terms last night before the strikes went in. It's important to stress that the Prime Minister hasn't taken a decision to launch any more strikes. But the warning that the UK, the US and other allies and partners made last week still stands, and the Houthis should take note of that.
Well, in a moment, we'll hear from Alistair Bunkle, our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. First, though, let's cross to Rob Powell, who's outside at number 10 for us this morning. Hello there, Rob. So the government very keen to justify why it's taken this action and appears to feel that it's gone to plan. But there's a question of what happens next.
Yeah, I think listening to the Minister and speaking to other people in government this morning, you do get a sense that they are confident in how this has been conducted and how it has been authorised as well. James Heappey saying that RAF jets took off from Cyprus at about 7:30 p.m. UK time last night. That was minutes before the Prime Minister was briefing his cabinet, but also briefing the Speaker of the House of Commons and also the Labour leader and his Shadow Defence Secretary as well. I think that the Prime Minister and Downing Street feel that warnings were made to Houthi rebels, that those red lines and ultimatums were crossed, and so they had no choice but to act. Crucially as well, they're not ruling out acting again if those attacks from the Houthi rebels continue. I think how Rishi Sunak has described this is limited, necessary and proportionate. And what we heard from James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, in that interview was a distinct attempt to sort of take the focus off some of the regional wider context, be it the Iran links, be it what is going on in Gaza as well. Clearly that context is deeply, deeply relevant, but I think that is all part of the UK attempt to avoid this escalating the regional conflict too much. In terms of where Labour is, the party has said this morning that it does back these attacks, these strikes. Have a listen to what the Shadow Defence Secretary told us a little earlier.
Everybody's concerned when a country and a Prime Minister commit armed forces to military action. It's a grave decision. We accept this, however, was limited action overnight. We accept that the timing was not in the hands of the UK government, and what we expect now is the Prime Minister to come to the House of Commons at the earliest opportunity on Monday to explain what the action aims to do.
Now, we do expect this to dominate business in the Commons on Monday. I think a statement from the Prime Minister is almost inevitable. I think it's unlikely we get any kind of vote on this, though. That would be a formality anyway, given Labour is backing this and pretty much all of the Tory MPs will be behind this too. We have heard some concern from one former minister, until recently a minister in fact, saying that there should be a very clear outline of what success looks like, what the point of this mission more broadly is. Within Labour as well, there has been a degree of concern, especially from people close to the last Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, people like John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, who are very critical of what has taken place overnight and the fact that Parliament wasn't given a vote ahead of the action taking place. Clearly, many of those MPs will be watching closely to see if any more airstrikes come over the weekend, given that the government certainly isn't ruling out more strikes if necessary.
And meanwhile, the Prime Minister not there in Downing Street, but actually in Kyiv this morning.
Yeah, shortly after Rishi Sunak finished briefing various people about the situation in the Middle East last night, he left in the early hours to travel to Kyiv. This is part of a big announcement the government is making about an increase in funding for Ukraine, military funding for Ukraine. Rishi Sunak today will also be meeting President Zelensky in Kyiv, signing a UK-Ukraine security cooperation agreement, essentially building on some promises made by the G7 nations to Ukraine to guarantee long-term security commitments to the country. So you're talking about things like intelligence sharing, training, things like that. I think with the focus internationally shifting somewhat, if you like, onto the Middle East from Ukraine in recent months, the UK is very keen to show the country and the world that it still stands behind Ukraine. Clearly, the last few weeks have seen an intensification of Russian strikes in Ukraine as well. So I think given all of that, the UK will be keen to re-emphasise, if you like, that given other global factors and demands and pressures at play, their commitment to standing behind President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people is unwavering.
And Rob, as you were speaking there, we're just seeing the latest pictures coming into us from Kyiv of the Prime Minister and his meetings there over Ukraine as he commits more funding, as you say. Slightly shaky pictures, which are just coming into us now. There is Rishi Sunak after a night of airstrikes arriving in Kyiv unexpectedly. Well, let's get the latest then on the strikes in Yemen overnight and across to Alistair Bunkle then, who's in Jerusalem for us. And speaking to the government this morning, they're keen to stress that these strikes were limited and proportionate, Alistair. But is there much concern where you are about an escalation that this could trigger?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, firstly, I don't think anybody's expecting that the Houthis won't retaliate. I mean, the Houthis are going to want to show that they still have the capability to carry out attacks against either Israel or shipping in the Red Sea. So I think it's not quite certain, but pretty likely that the Houthis will retaliate in some form. And then if they do, obviously depending on the form of that retaliation, then I think the US and the UK will be compelled to act again, because now having carried out the initial wave of strikes against the Houthis, they need to make good on that and continue to act until the Houthis are no longer threatening global shipping. So there is that. Then you have to look elsewhere around the region and wonder what further reaction there could be, because Iran sort of sits at the centre of this and their various proxies. One of those is Hamas, of course. Now, I don't think you're going to get any reaction from Hamas, particularly because their capabilities have been degraded very significantly over the last 3 and a bit months. Hezbollah are the big Iranian proxy, the best armed by a long way, and things on the border between Israel and Lebanon have been very, very tense over the last few days, week or so. Hezbollah, though, have been very careful in how they've calibrated their response to the Israel-Hamas war. They've been clearly not wanting to get involved in a full-scale conflict with Israel. And so I don't think that they would choose this moment to escalate things much further. So I think probably in the short term, at least, I would look to a few other areas, perhaps Iraq, where there is a sizable number of Iranian-backed militias who have already been carrying out attacks against US forces based in and around Iraq as a result of their support for Israel. So I think that's one area where the Americans will be on high alert. The Saudis, I don't think this is quite as likely, but the Saudis have been fighting a long war with the Houthis, but currently are in peace talks with them. But the Saudis will be worried that they might be dragged into it, but the indications are we're getting from the Houthis that what happened last night is not going to affect those peace talks. But the point is that there are so many areas around the Middle East now that are incredibly tense and volatile, that there will almost certainly be a reaction. But I think for me, it'd probably be the Red Sea and the Houthis and Iraq and Syria where I would look to see what happens next.
OK, Alistair, certainly worth watching very closely. Thanks very much indeed for your analysis this morning. Thanks, Alistair. Now, Israel will be forced to address accusations that it's committed genocide against Palestinians in Gaza today. It's the second day of a hearing at the United Nations International Court of Justice in a case brought by South Africa. Our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn has the latest from The Hague.
Well, this was a historic hearing. It is a historic two-day hearing in which, for the first time, Israel, a nation founded in the aftermath of the worst genocide in history, is itself in court, in the World Court, as the International Court of Justice is called, defending itself against these allegations brought by South Africa that it is engaged itself in a genocide in Gaza. And its job today, its lawyers' turn in court today, is to push back against this claim launched by South Africa and made pretty forensically yesterday that it is involved in a deliberate attempt to eradicate the Palestinians of Gaza. I asked the South African Justice Minister yesterday if he personally believed that, and he said yes, he does. He believes that Israel is trying to wipe out the Palestinians in Gaza. And I think the problem for Israel today is that the South Africans were quite effective in preemptively seeing what the Israelis were planning to do and then seeing off that threat. So saying the Israelis are probably going to say they had to do this in self-defense. Well, if that's the case, why have 22,000 Palestinians died, the majority of them civilian men, women and children? And I think the weakest flank for the Israelis is these comments by everyone from the Israeli Prime Minister down that the South Africans say are inflammatory and genocidal, particularly the references made by the Israeli Prime Minister drawing on the passages of the scripture in which Jews in the Old Testament wiped out men, women and children and livestock of their enemies that the South Africans would say were acted on by their soldiers. So it's going to be a tough day for the Israelis in court, and there is a huge amount at stake, not just for Israel, but also by Britain and America, who say that the war in Gaza is necessary and is justified to see off the threat of Hamas. And the stakes have been raised, of course, by their airstrikes overnight, which will be seen by hundreds of millions of people across the region as America and Britain coming in a military sense now on the side of Israel.
Dominic Waghorn there in The Hague, and we'll get plenty of updates from him throughout the day. In the meantime, do stay with us. Lots coming up for you here on Sky News Breakfast, including as British and American forces launch missile strikes at targets across Yemen. I'm going to be joined by the Liberal Democrats' Foreign Affairs spokesperson. That's coming up next.
Spencer, and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay.
We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that? Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited. Hello. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well? I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me!
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
figures out this morning show that the UK economy grew by more than expected in November last year. So the UK economy grew by 0.3% in that month, and that's compared to October, where it contracted by 0.3%. Well, let's bring in our business presenter, Ian King, who's in the city for us this morning. And Ian, things look like they're heading in the right direction. How pleased should we be by these figures?
Well, they're reasonably encouraging, Anna. There were a few factors at play in November, though, that I think contributed to this. If you look at the breakdown, the composition of GDP growth during the month, the heavy lifting was really done by the services sector, which expanded by 0.4% during the month, compared with just 0.1% in October. And I think a lot of that was driven, according to the ONS, by consumer-facing industries, particularly the retail sector. Bear in mind, you had the Black Friday promotional period at the end of that month, and I know from speaking to chief executives of Boots and Currys over recent weeks, they enjoyed a very, very strong Black Friday trading period, so that was a factor as well. The ONS also pointing out there were other areas of strength on the consumer-facing side of the economy, for example, car leasing and computer games. There was positive activity there. But production, which includes manufacturing, that also had a reasonably good November. The sector there expanded by 0.3%. That was compared with a contraction of 1.3% during October. Construction, well, that's still contracted, I'm afraid, down by 0.2% during the month, but that was an improvement on the 0.4% contraction that it saw in October, the ONS suggesting that the weather in November may have played a part there. If you look at the broader picture, though, the economy is still really basically flatlining. Over the 3 months to the end of November, the economy contracted by 0.2%. That drop in October really very much at play there. We obviously had a contraction of 0.1% during the third quarter. So as things stand, technically we're on course for a very, very mild recession. But we'll have to wait and see what the December figures show. And of course, these numbers are always prone to revision. I suspect that that third quarter contraction may be revised away in the fullness of time.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, won't it? Ian, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. So let's go back now to our top story and that joint missile strikes by the US and UK last night against Houthi targets in Yemen. We can get more reaction now. I'm joined by the Liberal Democrats Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Layla Moran. Very good morning to you, Layla Moran. Thanks so much for talking to us. Do you back the government in taking this action against the Houthis?
The fact is, we don't have, as Liberal Democrats, the information to do that yet. We haven't had briefings. We haven't had a debate in Parliament where they've come to explain the full extent of this. I should make clear, we are absolutely against what the Houthis are doing. The effect that this is having on global shipping lanes, the fact that they keep attacking ships that have absolutely nothing to do with the war in Israel, Gaza, absolutely they need to be stopped. But there are big questions that also need to be answered, and that's why we have asked for a recall of Parliament. That would be in line with the hard-fought convention that has lasted 20 years, with the exception of the 2018 vote that Theresa May did not take a vote on Syria. And that would mean that we would be able to have the debate, because the escalatory propensity for what could happen next are big questions, and we haven't had that information. So as it currently stands, I can't tell you if we absolutely back it or not. We do want the Houthis to stop doing what they're doing, but we have questions about, is this the most effective way, and what are the plans for the what next? Because I don't think we've had any of those answers yet, even from the government and what they have been saying.
So would you like to have a retrospective vote on this?
Exactly right. So there is a precedent for this as well. When the military action in Libya was taken, there was a retrospective vote. We understand, and we've heard from this morning, the timing of this was out of the hands of the government. I would point out that, however, this was hardly a surprise. There were noises that this was potentially going to happen for a couple of weeks now. And whilst there was questions in the House on defence, there was no debate, and there could have been for example, a preemptive vote on the principle of what are the parameters in which we might do something like this, where we could have tried to dig down into some of the detail. The issues with this, the risks are very well known. What the Liberal Democrats stand ready to do is to call on the government to ask for a recall of Parliament, to come in tomorrow if necessary. We don't know now what the retaliation from the Houthis is going to be. We don't know what Iran is going to do. And whilst there has been some coordination with other allies, there are big ones that are missing, most notably Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. So all of these questions remain unanswered. We need a debate and a vote in Parliament, and retrospectively would mean that we protect that hard-fought convention. Yes, there's a royal prerogative that they could just do this on their own, but that takes us back to where we were before the Iraq War, and we all know how that ended.
I spoke to James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, a little bit earlier, and he was keen to stress that this was an act of self-defence. He said that it was the action was limited, necessary and proportionate. And Labour, too, have backed what the government did. I mean, is there any point for a vote, given that it would be a foregone conclusion, wouldn't it?
Well, it's already happened, so absolutely it would be a retrospective vote, and we may well find that the whole of Parliament agrees with this. But it is not sufficient to say that just because, you know, John Healey's had a briefing, that the rest of Parliament needs to just roll over and not have its scrutiny. Every MP has an equal right to an equal say. That's how it works in a democracy, and we haven't had that opportunity. So what the Liberal Democrats are saying, along with others, is that we should have a recall of Parliament, but that protection of the convention is important. We reject the idea that just because they are, you know, limited and in self-defence, you know, ifs and buts. The convention had been that any military intervention by the UK, we are the only other country other than the US doing this, right on the front line, that we would then have a recall of Parliament and a vote. If we can have that scrutiny, that only makes our democracy stronger.
OK, well, Layla Moran, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for sharing your take on it this morning. We appreciate it. Let's take a look now at what the weather's doing.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the weather looks settled and cold for now, but there is a chance of significant snow next week. It's a mostly dry and cold start with a widespread frost in the north. England, Wales and Ireland will be mostly overcast through the morning.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Do stay with us. Coming up here on Sky News Breakfast, we'll have all the latest developments on Yemen and get analysis from our defence editor, Deborah Haynes. Welcome back. Let's just remind you of our top story here this morning. And Yemen's Houthis have threatened to retaliate following US-British strikes overnight, also warning they'll continue to block global trade routes in the Red Sea. Rishi Sunak says the strikes were taken in self-defence, but his Armed Forces Minister hasn't ruled out the possibility of further action. And the US Air Force says the multinational force struck more than 60 targets at 16 sites in Yemen. Missiles were fired at radar systems, air defence systems and storage and launch sites. And the US President Joe Biden says he'll take further measures if he has to. So let's discuss these strikes a little bit further. Our defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is back. Hi there, Deborah. And first of all, give us a sense of what you see as the significance of these strikes. How big a moment is this?
It's a really big moment. This is Britain and the US launching offensive actions into Yemen at a time when the region is already on the brink of an escalating conflict, given Israel's war in Gaza. So tensions were already high, and into that mix, the UK and the US and other allies have calculated that taking the additional risk of launching strikes against Iranian-backed Houthi militias inside Yemen is the lesser of two evils than to have done nothing. Because you'll remember just over a week ago, this coalition, a US-led coalition, issued an extraordinary warning saying to the Houthis, you must stop these attacks against shipping in the Red Sea or face the consequences. Now the consequences have been faced because the Houthis called their bluff by carrying on with these attacks. And the question really is what's going to happen next.
And we've got some of the details emerging of where the targets were. So what have we learned about how widespread these strikes were?
Yes, so the balancing act that the commanders would have been making is to ensure that they launched a meaningful strike. Like, the intent is to degrade and destroy the ability of the militias to launch these drones and these missiles against shipping in the Red Sea. They've been doing that, they say, in response to Israel's war in Gaza, linking it to ships linked to the Israeli war that they're targeting. The UK and the US say that's nonsense. This is about protecting global shipping. So the targets, 16 different areas altogether, more than 100 precision-guided munitions used, missiles and bombs, launched from aircraft. For the UK, it was 4 Typhoon jets operating out of Cyprus. For the Americans, they've got a large aircraft carrier in the region, and jets took off from there. They also launched missiles from ships and from submarines, hitting these targets. We've seen images of that. The question is how far they've managed to degrade, and is it going to be enough to deter?
Well, and I'll leave that question hanging in the air, but yeah, that is the question that will be on everyone's mind, won't it? Deborah, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's get more reaction now. We can talk to Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mail. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. What is your response to these strikes having taken place overnight?
I think they had to take place, Anna. It was very clear that the warnings had been given. The cost-benefit analysis for the Houthis is a very odd one to try and work out. They've got all sorts of issues of their own within Yemen. There's a civil war with many of the Sunni separatists in the south of Yemen. There's a humanitarian crisis. There's ISIS and AQ there. There's a fight really against the Saudi Arabian coalition already. So the Houthis have sort of opened this additional flank in the Red Sea, largely at the behest, I suspect, of the Iranian backers. They're not puppets of the Iranians, but they have a certain amount of agency. And so the question that comes back to, given that this will begin to alter the balance of power within Yemen, whether the Houthis either say to their Iranian backers, we don't want to provoke anymore, or whether actually the Iranians say, given this is their Houthi attacks are on global maritime international travel, I think it's time to back off. So they have the capacity to strike back. They have the capacity to retaliate, very asymmetric warfare, given the sort of capabilities. But we could certainly escalate, and a lot of it actually is in the hands of players other than the Houthis themselves.
Well, yes, what does happen next? Because the Houthis have already come out this morning saying that they plan to continue their strikes in the Red Sea. So what action is likely to happen next? Is the UK going to strike again? And at what point does it draw a line?
I think it will strike again. I think it'd be looking around, in the battle of the narratives at the moment. Of course, what we're trying to avoid is this being a sort of American-British attack on Muslims who are, demonstrating against the actions of the Israelis in Gaza. It's very easy to see how you build up this sort of a narrative. And what Britain and America want to do is make sure that the whole international community see that, given the preponderance of trade that's conducted in the maritime, has to go, or if it doesn't go through the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Straits, Strait of Gibraltar, will have a detrimental effect to everybody who's got an interest in rules-based maritime trade. So there are plenty of people who can put pressure on the Houthis, and it depends what their sort of mindset is. And it's very difficult to judge the Houthis by a sort of cost-benefit risk analysis that we would conduct ourselves.
Well, yes. What's your risk analysis? How risky do you think the situation is now?
Well, I think what we'll find is automatically trade, which is down from, I think, something like 200,000 containers a day to from 500,000 containers a day to 200,000, will drop even further as people work out. There'll just be a default setting to route around the Red Sea now. It's a disaster for the Egyptians, who rely hugely. Deborah mentioned response to the Egyptians. They rely hugely on traffic through the Suez Canal for income. They're in a position to put, again, pressure on the Houthis. A lot of pressure in Tehran will be to say, tell your proxies, we've got other issues to deal with. But one of them is, if you disrupt global trade, there will be consequences for you. The Chinese will be worried about a disruption of the oil trade from the Gulf to themselves because of their dependence on Middle East oil. So it really is a case of the old cry: if you want to understand the problem, you've got to get yourself a bigger map. This is a global issue that's focused on a few targets in Yemen at the moment, but the consequences are huge, and certainly the potential for escalation is huge. So it will be interesting to see actually whatever the Houthis are saying, what other people are saying to them about the capacity for them to generate escalatory responses.
Well, I suspect we may be talking about this again, but for the moment, we must say thank you to you, Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayer. We're out of time, but so interesting to get your analysis on these strikes overnight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.
Now, the public inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal resumes this morning, and also today the cases of several postmasters will be heard in Scotland, where appeals against convictions are also underway. So let's get the latest from our Scotland correspondent, Conor Gillis, who's in Edinburgh for us this morning. So, Conor, talk us through what's happening there in Scotland today, then.
Yeah, well, clearly there has been a painful, glacial pace of justice here in Scotland. There were around 100 convictions for sub-postmasters linked to the Horizon scandal in Scotland. 3 of those cases have been rumbling on through the courts for very many years, and they are being heard here in court today. Now, unlike in England and Wales, where the Post Office themselves were acting as a private prosecutor in taking people to court, here in Scotland it was the Public Prosecution Service, the Crown Office, who were pursuing people and landing people with criminal convictions over the course of very many years. Now, it has emerged over the course of the last number of days that the Prosecution Service here in Scotland became aware of issues with the Horizon scandal back in 2013, and it didn't stop pursuing cases and convictions until 2015. So clearly there are questions for the Crown Office here in Scotland about what it knew and when, and clearly about whether it reviewed cases dating back decades around the Horizon scandal. This hearing will continue over the course of this morning, and it is a symbol of this scandal that this continues to rumble on all these years.
OK, Conor, thanks very much indeed. I know you'll keep us up to date. Thank you, though. Jackie's back, as you can see, and we're going to have another of those moments where you've got a really nice story that's not in your bulletin.
Yeah, it's not. It's not.
You had your phone out.
No, it's not in the sports bulletin. But it's really lovely. It's in all the papers today. The photographs. It was on our website last night. But it is Rob Burrow and Kevin Sinfield being awarded their CBEs by Prince William. He went all the way up to Headingley to their dressing room because obviously it's a huge hassle for Rob to get anywhere, and presenting them in the dressing room. There's flash photography, obviously, in those pictures, but what a sort of beautiful moment, really.
For a beautiful pair. I mean, they are amazing.
50 million raised and amazing friends, and he carries them over the line in his marathons. Just incredible.
Yeah.
Anyway, not in the sports bulletin.
I'm glad you got it in there.
Here is the sports bulletin. Let's have a look.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Right, Alex, Calvin, we've got AFCON around the corner, so thought we'd test out your knowledge with a little African player quiz, all about the Premier League. Alex with a slightly fresher trim today than Calvin. So you're already 1-0 up. Yeah, don't look at mine, mine's worse.
You're in it as well, man.
So we'll start off with games played. Just tell me if you could just read out the names, actually, one of you that we got there.
Sholam Yobi, Wilfred Zaha, Kolo Toure and Cheick Kouyaté.
So who do you think's got the most games played out of them four? We'll start with you, Calvin, go on.
Zaha for me.
You're going Zaha,
Yeah.
Calvin, Alex?
I'm going to go Kolo.
All right, reveal.
Come on, knowledge.
So we got we've got yellow cards. So we've got Cheick Kouyaté, Abdoulaye Doucouré, Wolf Zaha and El Hadj Diouf.
Attacking players, because these three are attacking players. It's hard. I'm going to go Tiote.
Okay.
Because he was a defensive midfielder. He's someone that, so I'm going to go Tiote.
Karen?
I think he could shock us, Bro, something's telling me because look, there's referees in each picture. There's no referee there. Yeah. I'm trying to look at it like that. Yeah, I'm trying to look at it like that. I'm going to say Diouf.
Have a look.
Yeah. Oh, yes! What? I told you, trick question. Look at you going into detail.
No trick questions.
What?
Right, so
you think he'll be a defensive midfielder, but...
Is that 2-0? Goals.
Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, Didier Drogba, Emmanuel Adebayo.
Okay, legend there, Premier League legends, top goal scorers. What do you reckon?
Salah? Yeah, I feel like it's going to be more. Yeah. Excellent finish. More Salah. Yeah, more Salah to be fair.
Yeah, both going Mo? Mo Salah?
Yeah.
There you go, right, 2-2, okay. So we've got assists here. So let me know who we got.
Mohamed Salah, Riyad Mahrez, Didier Drogba, Sadio Mane. I'm going to go Salah again,
Yeah?
I'm going to go Salah again.
Calvin, what you saying?
Because his stats are outrageous. Yeah. But then Riyad, I'm going Riyad Mahrez.
Have a look.
I knew it. Bro, his stats are outrageous. Lucas Radebe, Joseph Yobo, Lauren, Kolo Toure.
Okay, so what are we thinking? These are clean sheets in the Premier League.
Clean sheets. Kolo Toure. Invincibles. Invincibles. That has to be. I'll be shocked. I'll be shocked. Has to be. Nah, I'll be fuming. Yeah, has to be. That was a clean one. He's a legend. He's a legend.
Yobo. How much of a legend is he, Yobo?
Like, probably one of the best defenders in Nigeria.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest.
Do you think sometimes players like that can get a little bit forgotten as well? Just like, obviously you guys have played for Nigeria, you go back there so you know like the kind of legendary names.
It depends on their status. But
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Thanks, Jackie. Still to come here on Sky News Breakfast, I'm going to be talking to a former British diplomat about last night's military action in Yemen. That's coming up next. Don't go away.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's go back now to our main story today and that joint missile strike by the US and the UK last night against Houthi targets in Yemen after the Iran-backed group defied a warning to stop targeting ships in the Red Sea. Well, we can get more reaction on these developments. I'm joined now by Lord Peter Ricketts, who was Britain's first national security advisor. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Were you at all surprised that this action happened last night? Were all the signs there in the last few days?
Yes, they were. I mean, this was very clearly foreshadowed. There have been warnings by the coalition of countries, including US and UK. Ministers yesterday were saying very clearly that action was imminent. And I think the trigger was that very complex attack on the actual naval task force itself a couple of nights ago, despite all the warnings. And I think that showed that the Houthis are just getting more and more reckless, more and more disruptive of this huge flow of trade that goes through the Red Sea. 20% of all the containers moving on maritime trades are going through the Red Sea. And so all the things that we buy in our shops, a lot of the food, oil and gas, is being disrupted by the Houthi rebels. And I think UK and US policymakers decided that it's gone on long enough, and we can't allow that to go ahead without a reaction to it.
Well, yes, and James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister I spoke to earlier, was very keen to stress that this was an act of self-defence, and he linked it to those attacks on British ships. What do you make of the way in which the government is framing this?
I mean, I think that's right, because the Iranians and the Houthis will want to portray this as a Western intervention on the side of Israel in the Israel-Gaza conflict. And of course, it's nothing of the kind. It comes after months of disruption of free trade in the waters of the Red Sea. A UN Security Council resolution passed a couple of days ago. The Russians and the Chinese did not try and stop it. It condemns the Houthi attacks. It takes note of the fact that countries do have the right to defend their shipping and freedom of navigation. So this is an issue involving the whole world. It's not Western intervention in the war on Israel. I don't think it is going to provoke direct intervention from the Iranians. It's a serious escalation. It's always a risk to take military measures in a tense situation. But I think the greater risk was not to do anything and to allow the Houthis effectively to take international trade hostage.
So very briefly, you think that the UK had no choice?
I think it had no choice. I think it's done the right thing. They will be hoping it was a strong enough strike to send a very clear message, and there won't be a need to do more. If the Houthis go on trying to disrupt trade, then I think there will be further strikes. And I think the risk of regional conflict spreading is relatively low.
OK, well, Lord Peter Ricketts, I'm afraid we had to keep it brief, but still managed to get your views across very pithily, so we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.